The padlock in Rachel Coleman's hand weighed almost nothing, a cheap piece of brass she'd bought at the hardware store for $4.99, but it felt heavier than the mortgage papers the bank had slid across the table 3 hours earlier. She stood on the cracked sidewalk of Millbrook Street, her breath fogging in the November cold, and stared up at the condemned building that was now, impossibly, hers. For stories of water-stained brick. Windows either boarded over with plywood gone soft from rain or gaping open like missing teeth. A front door that hung from a single hinge, the wood split down the middle where someone had pried it open long ago looking for copper pipe or anything else they could sell. A faded sign above the entrance still read in ghost letters, Coleman Brothers Dry Goods, 1923. The Coleman brothers had nothing to do with her. Just a coincidence. Just the universe's idea of a joke. Behind her, across the narrow street, stood the house. Their house. The two-story colonial with the blue shutters Rachel had painted herself 3 summers ago, standing on a ladder while her husband David steadied it from below, and their daughter Emma, then 6 years old, handed up the roller with both small hands like it was the most important job in the world. The house where David had built Emma's treehouse in the maple out back. The house where Rachel had learned, in their kitchen at 11:47 on a Tuesday night, that the car in the driveway belonged to a state trooper, not her husband, and that David wasn't coming home that night or any night after. The house the bank had taken from them 6 hours ago with a foreclosure notice and a padlock of its own. Rachel Coleman, 34 years old, widowed for 2 years and 4 months. Mother of an 8-year-old girl who was right now sitting in the back of their 2008 Honda Accord with a trash bag full of clothes and a stuffed elephant named Mr. Peanut, had just spent her last $6 on a condemned building across the street from the house she'd lost. $6, because that's what the city had priced it at when they'd added it to the municipal auction list, a symbolic amount, a number that meant nobody wanted it, a number that meant the city just wanted it off their books before the next inspection cycle. $6 and the assumption of all back taxes, which the deputy clerk had told her, when she'd asked, came to about $14,000, payable within 3 years or the city would take it back. She hadn't had 3 years to think about it. She'd had 14 minutes, because that's how long had been left on the online auction when she'd typed in her credit card number, the one with the $200 limit she'd kept hidden from David's creditors, and clicked confirm. Now she stood in the cold, holding the padlock, and wondered if she had completely lost her mind. "Mom." Emma's voice came thin and small from behind her. Rachel turned. Her daughter had climbed out of the Accord and stood on the curb, her winter coat zipped up to her chin, her dark hair escaping from a ponytail that had gone 3 days without being redone. Emma's eyes, which were David's eyes, the same warm brown with flecks of gold in them, studied the building with the careful, measuring gaze of a child who had learned in the last 28 months that adults didn't always make sense. "Is this where we're sleeping?" Rachel opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. The truthful answer was, "I don't know, baby." The truthful answer was, "We can't sleep in the car in November in Ohio because it's going to get below freezing tonight, and the Accord's heater quit working in September, and I can't afford to fix it." The truthful answer was, "The shelter on Grant Street is full until Thursday because I already called them from the parking lot of the bank after the woman with the clipboard explained to me what a trustee sale was, and your mother could not stop herself from crying in public in front of strangers." The truthful answer was, "This building was on the city's auction list because everyone else thinks it's going to collapse in the next big snowstorm, and maybe they're right, but at least it has a roof, and at least it has 4 walls, and at least nobody can tell us we have to leave, because it's ours now. Legally, and legal is the only kind of safe I have left." But Emma was 8 years old, and Emma had already lost her father, and Emma had already lost her bedroom and her school and the swing set in the backyard and the neighbor's dog she used to walk for $5, and Rachel was not going to make her daughter also lose the story that mothers were supposed to know what they were doing. So Rachel smiled the smile she had practiced in the rearview mirror for 2 years and said, "Yeah, honey, it's going to be like camping, an adventure." Emma looked at the building. She looked at her mother. She looked at the building again. "Is it going to be scary?" "No," Rachel said, and her voice didn't break, which she counted as a small victory. "No, it's going to be okay. I promise." 6 months earlier, Rachel Coleman had been a licensed practical nurse at St. Catherine's Hospital, pulling 12-hour shifts 3 days a week on the oncology floor. Not a glamorous job, Not a high-paying one, but a steady one. $49,000 a year, plus benefits, plus a 401k that David had insisted they both contribute to back when both of them were contributing to things. She'd liked her patience. She'd been good at her work. 17 years she'd been a nurse. Ever since she'd finished her LPN certification at the community college at 22, a month before she'd met David at a coffee shop near campus, a month before the whole rest of her life had begun. Then in April, St. Catherine's had been bought by a larger hospital system out of Indianapolis. The new administration had restructured the nursing staff. They'd kept the RNs and laid off the LPNs, offering them a choice. Go back to school and get your RN certification on your own dime, or take a severance package of 6 weeks' pay and a handshake. Rachel had taken the severance because she had Emma and she had the mortgage and she had David's medical bills still coming in the mail from the ICU. He'd spent 9 days in before they turned off the machines, and she did not have 18 months of tuition and living expenses to sink into a degree that might or might not get her rehired. She tried everywhere after that. Every hospital within 60 miles. Every nursing home. Every urgent care. Every clinic. Some of them were hiring, but only RNs. Some of them said they'd call her back and didn't. Some of them looked at her application and asked why she'd left her last job, and when she explained, she could see them file her away in the mental folder labeled someone else's problem. The severance ran out in June. The savings ran out in August. The credit cards maxed out in September. The mortgage went into default in October. In early November, the bank had sent a letter explaining that the foreclosure sale was scheduled for the 15th and that she and any occupants would need to vacate the premises by 5 p.m. on November 19th. Today was November 19th. It was 4:47 p.m. The bank's locksmith had shown up at 2 o'clock to change the locks while Rachel had stood on the front lawn with Emma and 3 garbage bags of clothes and a Rubbermaid tote of Emma's books and a framed photograph of David holding Emma at her 5th birthday party. The locksmith had not looked at her. The bank's representative had not looked at her. Only the neighbor across the fence, Mrs. Dalworth, had looked at her, and Mrs. Dalworth's face had arranged itself into the expression Rachel had come to recognize in the last 2 years, the expression that was supposed to be sympathy, but was really just relief that this was happening to someone else. The auction listing had found her at 3:14 p.m., sitting in the Accord in the CVS parking lot, trying to figure out whether the $37 left in her checking account should go toward gas or toward food for Emma's dinner. She'd been scrolling through Craigslist looking for rooms to rent, and a sidebar ad had caught her eye. City of Millbrook, Ohio. Surplus property auction. Ends today, 5 p.m. She'd clicked on it out of something that wasn't quite hope and wasn't quite curiosity. Just the particular numbness of a person who had run out of real options and was now just clicking on things to see what happened. The listings had been what she'd expected. A stretch of undeveloped land by the landfill. A burned-out warehouse on the south side. A strip of easement along Route 6 that the county didn't want to mow anymore. And then, second from the bottom, she'd seen it. 4412 Millbrook Street. Former commercial building, mixed-use residential upper floors. Condemned 2019. Starting bid, $6.00. Assumption of tax liability required. Property sold as is. Current bids, 0. She'd stared at the address until her eyes had lost focus. 4412 Millbrook Street. She knew that address. She knew that address because every time she'd driven home for the last 9 years, she'd passed it. Because her own house was 4411 Millbrook Street. Because the condemned building with the plywood windows was, literally, across the street from the house the bank had taken that morning. The coincidence had hit her like a physical thing, had stopped her breath for a full 10 seconds while Emma, in the passenger seat, had asked her what was wrong, and Rachel had said nothing. Nothing was wrong. She was just thinking. And she had sat there in the CVS parking lot for another 20 minutes, watching the countdown on the auction page, watching nobody else place a bid, and she had thought about the night ahead. She had thought about where she was going to put Emma, who didn't yet fully understand that the house was gone, who still thought they were just going on a little trip while the bank and the lawyers figured things out. She had thought about the weather forecast on the dashboard radio, which had said overnight low of 28 degrees. She had thought about her Aunt Linda in Columbus, who had offered to take them in until things settled down, but who lived in a one-bedroom condo with a husband on dialysis, and Rachel could not bring herself to make that call, not tonight, not when it would feel so final. And she had thought, wildly, stupidly, that if she could just get through tonight, just one night, just put a roof over her daughter's head for the next 12 hours until the shelter opened a bed on Thursday, then she could figure out the rest. She'd typed in her credit card number. She'd clicked confirm. She'd paid $6.00 plus a $19 processing fee to the city of Millbrook. And at 4:03 p.m., an automated email had arrived in her inbox congratulating her on her successful bid and informing her that the deed would be processed within 10 business days, that keys could be obtained from the city clerk's office if any existed, and that the property was sold as is with no warranty of habitability, safety, or structural integrity. The clerk had handed her one key when she'd gone down to pick up the closing paperwork. A single brass key on a paper tag that read 4412 Millbrook, back door only. The front door, he'd explained, had been pried open years ago and never properly relocked. If she wanted to secure the property, she'd need to put her own lock on it. The hardware store on 5th Street was still open until 6. He'd said this with a kind of resigned politeness, like he was used to telling people bad news, like he'd seen a lot of sad cases come through his office and Rachel Coleman was just one more. He had not asked her why she was buying a condemned building. She had been grateful for that. Now, in the fading November light, she looked at her daughter standing on the curb with her small pink winter coat zipped up to her chin, and she pushed the cheap brass padlock into her pocket and forced her voice to sound light and confident. "Okay, Em, let's go check out our new place." Emma followed her across the street, walking carefully around the patches of broken asphalt where the city hadn't bothered to repave. The front door of 4412 was, as the clerk had promised, already open. It had been open for years by the look of it. Rachel pushed it inward, and the hinges screamed a sound that made Emma grab the back of her mother's jacket. The smell hit them first, musty wet plaster and something animal, probably mice, and the cold damp of a building that hadn't been heated in 6 winters. Rachel clicked on the flashlight on her phone. The beam showed a long, narrow space that had once been a storefront. Empty shelving leaning against one wall. A counter near the back with an old cash register still sitting on it. The drawer hanging open, rusted and black. The floor was hardwood, warped in places where water had gotten in, but still solid. The tin ceiling, 12 feet above them, was stamped with an ornate pattern that had once been painted white and was now the color of old teeth. "It's really big," Emma whispered. Children always whispered in empty places. "It used to be a store," Rachel said. "See the counter? People used to come in and buy flour and sugar and I don't know, bolts of cloth maybe. This was a long time ago. Before Daddy." Rachel's throat closed. "Yeah, baby. Way before Daddy." They moved deeper into the space. Rachel's flashlight beam caught a staircase at the back, narrow and steep, leading up to the 2nd floor. She could see water damage on the ceiling where the upper floor had leaked. She could see the tracks of small animals in the dust on the floor. She could see a pile of what used to be pigeons in one corner, just feathers and bones now. She steered Emma away from that corner. She kept her voice steady. Behind the counter, she found a door that led to a back room, and another door beyond that led to a small rear vestibule. The back door was there, heavy and steel, rusted but solid, with a deadbolt and a regular lock. Her brass key from the clerk fit the deadbolt. She tested it. The bolt turned. She locked it again. Then she took her cheap new padlock and looped it through the premises by 5 p.m. on November 19th. Today was November 19th. It was 4:47 p.m. The bank's locksmith had shown up at 2 o'clock to change the locks while Rachel had stood on the front lawn with Emma and 3 garbage bags of clothes and a Rubbermaid tote of Emma's books and a framed photograph of David holding Emma at her 5th birthday party. The locksmith had not looked at her. The bank's representative had not looked at her. Only the neighbor across the fence, Mrs. Dalworth, had looked at her, and Mrs. Dalworth's face had arranged itself into the expression Rachel had come to recognize in the last 2 years, the expression that was supposed to be sympathy, but was really just relief that this was happening to someone else. The auction listing had found her at 3:14 p.m., sitting in the Accord in the CVS parking lot, trying to figure out whether the $37 left in her checking account should go toward gas or toward food for Emma's dinner. She'd been scrolling through Craigslist looking for rooms to rent, and a sidebar ad had caught her eye. City of Millbrook, Ohio. Surplus property auction. Ends today, 5 p.m. She'd clicked on it out of something that wasn't quite hope, and wasn't quite curiosity. Just the particular numbness of a person who had run out of real options and was now just clicking on things to see what happened. The listings had been what she'd expected. A stretch of undeveloped land by the landfill. A burned-out warehouse on the south side. A strip of easement along Route 6 that the county didn't want to mow anymore. And then, second from the bottom, she'd seen it. 4412 Millbrook Street. Former commercial building, mixed-use residential upper floors. Condemned 2019. Starting bid, $6.00. Assumption of tax liability required. Property sold as is. Current bids, 0. She'd stared at the address until her eyes had lost focus. 4412 Millbrook Street. She knew that address. She knew that address because every time she'd driven home for the last 9 years, she'd passed it. Because her own house was 4411 Millbrook Street. Because the condemned building with the plywood windows was, literally, across the street from the house the bank had taken that morning. The coincidence had hit her like a physical thing, had stopped her breath for a full 10 seconds while Emma, in the passenger seat, had asked her what was wrong, and Rachel had said nothing. Nothing was wrong. She was just thinking. And she had sat there in the CVS parking lot for another 20 minutes, watching the countdown on the auction page, watching nobody else place a bid, and she had thought about the night ahead. She had thought about where she was going to put Emma, who didn't yet fully understand that the house was gone, who still thought they were just going on a little trip while the bank and the lawyers figured things out. She had thought about the weather forecast on the dashboard radio, which had said overnight low of 28 degrees. She had thought about her Aunt Linda in Columbus, who had offered to take them in until things settled down, but who lived in a one-bedroom condo with a husband on dialysis. And Rachel could not bring herself to make that call, not tonight, not when it would feel so final. And she had thought, wildly, stupidly, that if she could just get through tonight, just one night, just put a roof over her daughter's head for the next 12 hours until the shelter opened a bed on Thursday, then she could figure out the rest. She'd typed in her credit card number. She'd clicked confirm. She'd paid $6.00 plus a $19 processing fee to the city of Millbrook. And at 4:03 p.m., an automated email had arrived in her inbox congratulating her on her successful bid and informing her that the deed would be processed within 10 business days, that keys could be obtained from the city clerk's office if any existed, and that the property was sold as is with no warranty of habitability, safety, or structural integrity. The clerk had handed her one key when she'd gone down to pick up the closing paperwork. A single brass key on a paper tag that read 4412 Millbrook, back door only. The front door, he'd explained, had been pried open years ago and never properly relocked. If she wanted to secure the property, she'd need to put her own lock on it. The hardware store on 5th Street was still open until 6. He'd said this with a kind of resigned politeness, like he was used to telling people bad news, like he'd seen a lot of sad cases come through his office and Rachel Coleman was just one more. He had not asked her why she was buying a condemned building. She had been grateful for that. Now, in the fading November light, she looked at her daughter standing on the curb with her small pink winter coat zipped up to her chin, and she pushed the cheap brass padlock into her pocket and forced her voice to sound light and confident. "Okay, Em, let's go check out our new place." Emma followed her across the street, walking carefully around the patches of broken asphalt where the city hadn't bothered to repave. The front door of 4412 was, as the clerk had promised, already open. It had been open for years by the look of it. Rachel pushed it inward, and the hinges screamed a sound that made Emma grab the back of her mother's jacket. The smell hit them first, musty wet plaster and something animal, probably mice, and the cold damp of a building that hadn't been heated in 6 winters. Rachel clicked on the flashlight on her phone. The beam showed a long, narrow space that had once been a storefront. Empty shelving leaning against one wall. A counter near the back with an old cash register still sitting on it. The drawer hanging open, rusted and black. The floor was hardwood, warped in places where water had gotten in, but still solid. The tin ceiling, 12 feet above them, was stamped with an ornate pattern that had once been painted white and was now the color of old teeth. "It's really big," Emma whispered. Children always whispered in empty places. "It used to be a store," Rachel said. "See the counter? People used to come in and buy flour and sugar and I don't know, bolts of cloth maybe. This was a long time ago. Before Daddy." Rachel's throat closed. Yeah, baby. Way before Daddy. They moved deeper into the space. Rachel's flashlight beam caught a staircase at the back, narrow and steep, leading up to the second floor. She could see water damage on the ceiling where the upper floor had leaked. She could see the tracks of small animals in the dust on the floor. She could see a pile of what used to be pigeons in one corner, just feathers and bones now. She steered Emma away from that corner. She kept her voice steady. Behind the counter, she found a door that led to a back room, and another door beyond that led to a small rear vestibule. The back door was there, heavy and steel, rusted but solid, with a deadbolt and a regular lock. Her brass key from the clerk fit the deadbolt. She tested it. The bolt turned. She locked it again. Then she took her cheap new padlock and looped it through the. Made Rachel want to lie down on the floor and weep for the rest of her life. Honey, you don't have to be sorry, Rachel said, and her voice did crack this time. She couldn't help it. You don't have to be sorry for a single thing. This is my job. Taking care of you is my job, and I'm going to do it, no matter what. Emma fell asleep at 8:30, curled in the middle of the pile of blankets with Mr. Peanut under her chin. Rachel lay beside her for a long time, listening to her daughter's breathing steady and slow, and she thought about the photograph in her coat pocket, and she thought about the $6 she had spent and the $14,000 in back taxes she could never pay, and she thought about the sound the front door had made when they'd walked in, the scream of the hinges. She thought about the shelter on Thursday. She thought about Aunt Linda in Columbus. She thought about her nursing license, which was current, and about the one clinic in Millbrook that had told her they might have something in January, 6 weeks from now. She thought about making it 6 weeks, about what that would actually require, about what she would have to do, what corners she would have to cut, what pride she would have to swallow to get from tonight to January. She did not cry. She had already cried earlier that day, in the bank parking lot, in front of Emma, and she had promised herself that was the last one. You got one cry per disaster. That was the rule she had made with herself after David's funeral. One cry, and then you got up, and then you figured out what had to happen next. She got up. She blew out one of the candles to save the wax. She took the other one and walked quietly through the doorway, out into the hall, to look around the building again. Because if she was going to live here, even for 3 days, even for one night, she needed to know what she was dealing with. She needed to know what else was in the building, what the water situation was, what the bathrooms downstairs looked like, whether there was a working breaker box anywhere, whether the roof was as bad as it looked from outside. The candle cast a small pool of yellow light around her as she moved down the hallway. She tested the locked door again, the third apartment, the one without a key. It didn't budge. She went past it and around the corner and found another staircase, a smaller one, leading up to a third floor. She climbed it carefully. The third floor was a single large open space, maybe 30 by 60 feet. It had once been an apartment, the largest one in the building, probably the owner's apartment back when the Coleman brothers had lived upstairs and worked downstairs. The ceiling sloped under the eaves of the roof. One wall had collapsed at some point, the plaster lying in piles on the floor, exposing the brick and the wooden joists behind it. A piano sat against the back wall, so covered in dust and pigeon droppings that Rachel wouldn't have recognized it as a piano if not for the shape. Against the front wall, under the window that looked out at Millbrook Street, stood a large oak roll-top desk, the kind you saw in antique stores selling for $800. Rachel walked over to the desk. She had always loved roll-top desks. David had promised her one, years ago, when they'd first moved into 4411 Millbrook. He'd said when Emma was grown and out of the house, he would buy her a roll-top desk for the study they were going to turn the spare bedroom into. A retirement project, he'd said. A thing to look forward to. She ran her finger through the dust on the top of the desk. She tried to roll the top back. It was stuck. The wood had swollen in 6 winters of unheated damp. She pulled harder. Something gave, and the roll-top slid back with a rattle, releasing a small cloud of dust that made her cough. The desk surface was mostly empty. A dried-up fountain pen. A blotter stained with old ink. A leather-bound ledger, the kind bookkeepers had used before computers. Rachel opened the ledger. The pages were filled with neat columns of numbers and dates. Coleman Brothers Dry Goods, 1923 to 1962. An entire business's records, 40 years of them. She flipped through. Pencils, 3 cents. Flour, 10 pounds, 42 cents. Cash paid, Account closed. Rent received. The ordinary arithmetic of a small-town business that had opened when her grandmother was a baby and closed when the interstate had come through and pulled the town's center 2 miles east. She closed the ledger. She was about to roll the desktop back down when her candle, guttering in a draft she couldn't identify, caught the edge of something else. A slim drawer on the left side of the desk, one she hadn't noticed at first because it was flush with the panel, no handle, just a thin slot of darker wood. A hidden drawer. Rachel had read about these, had seen them on one of those antique appraisal shows David had liked to watch. Most old desks had them. Places for the merchant to keep the day's take until he could get to the bank. She pressed the panel. It clicked and sprang open about half an inch. She pulled it the rest of the way. Inside was an envelope. Manila, the old thick kind, yellowed with age. And on the front, in the same blue ballpoint handwriting as the photograph downstairs, was written a single line. To whoever finds this after we're gone. Rachel held the envelope in the candlelight. Her hands had started shaking, and she wasn't sure why, because it was probably nothing. It was probably just an old letter, a reminiscence, the kind of thing people wrote when they were clearing out a family business after 40 years. It was probably nothing important at all. She opened it anyway. Inside were 2 things. The first was a folded piece of cream-colored paper, heavy bond, the kind lawyers used. The second was a small brass key, different from the one she'd gotten from the city clerk. Older, heavier, with a complicated set of teeth that suggested a lock more serious than a rusted back door. She set the key on the desk. She unfolded the paper. The handwriting was different this time. Not the woman's blue ballpoint. This was a man's hand, careful and deliberate, in black fountain pen. If you are reading this letter, it began, then my brother Robert and I have either passed or have been driven by circumstances to leave our father's building and never return. I do not know who you are. I do not know what brought you to this place, or what need has made you the kind of person who would push open a rolltop desk in a condemned building and look for secrets. But I know this much. I know that my father, James Coleman Sr., who built this store with his own hands in 1923 and ran it until he died in 1971, was a man who believed that what we earn in this life is meant to be passed forward, not hoarded. He believed that buildings and businesses and family names were simply the visible frame around the invisible thing, which was our obligation to one another. Rachel had to stop reading. Her chest was tight. She was standing in the dark on the 3rd floor of a condemned building at 9:47 at night, holding a candle and a 60-year-old letter, and her hands were shaking so badly the flame was trembling. And she did not know why, but she felt, suddenly and without warning, that she was not alone in this room. She took a breath. She made herself keep reading. My brother and I, the letter went on, were the last of the Coleman line. My father had hoped one of us would marry and continue the name, but I was not the marrying kind, and Robert's wife passed before they had any children. In 1988, after Robert's health turned, we made the decision to close the store and leave this town, which by then had already begun to die. We did not sell the building. We could not bring ourselves to sell it. This building was our father, to us. It was the whole of his life's labor. To sell it to a stranger, to watch strangers tear it down or turn it into something he would not have recognized, was a thing we could not do. So we did something else instead. We placed within this building a provision, a gift, if you will, for whoever someday might need this place more than we did. Our father had accumulated, over his lifetime, a certain body of assets that he had kept carefully separate from the business. He did not trust banks, having lived through the crash of '29. He kept his wealth in forms he could see and touch. He kept most of it here. Rachel's legs had gone weak. She sat down on the dusty floor beside the desk, the letter trembling in her hand, the candle wobbling on the desk above her. She made herself keep reading. Robert and I did not need our father's assets. We had enough to live out our years quietly. But we did not want to leave those assets to the state or to distant cousins we had never met. We wanted them to pass to someone who came to this building because they truly needed it. So we hid them. We locked them away behind the door at the back of the basement, the steel door that was installed in 1934 and that no one except our father and ourselves has ever opened. The key in this envelope opens that door. The combination to the inner chamber beyond is written at the bottom of this letter. We do not know who you are, whoever is reading this. We do not know if you will be honorable or dishonorable, kind or cruel, deserving or undeserving. But we have made our choice, and we leave it in the hands of fate and in the hands of a God we have tried, however imperfectly, to believe in. Use what you find well. Build something with it. Help someone with it. Do not hoard it, as our Father did, out of fear of the future. Fear is the thief of all good things. With a weary heart and whatever hope remains to us. James Coleman Jr. October 14, 1988. At the bottom of the page, in the same careful black ink, was written a combination. October 14, 23. October 14, 1923. The day Rachel realized that James Coleman Sr. had opened Coleman Brothers Dry Goods for the first time. Rachel Coleman sat on the filthy floor of a condemned building on Millbrook Street in Millbrook, Ohio, and she held a letter written by a dead man in 1988 and a brass key to a steel door in the basement. And she thought about her 8-year-old daughter asleep 2 floors below her. And she thought about her husband David, who had been dead for 2 years and 4 months. And she thought about her own last name, Coleman, which was David's name, which she had taken when she'd married him at 24, and which was not, she had always assumed, connected in any way to the Coleman brothers who had run the dry goods store across the street from the house she and David had bought 9 years ago. Because Coleman was a common name. Because Millbrook was a small town. Because life did not hand you letters like this. Not really. Not to people like her. She sat for a long time. The candle burned down. The wax pooled on the desktop. Somewhere below, Emma turned over in her sleep and whimpered, and then went quiet again. A wind picked up outside, and Rachel could hear it in the loose tin of the roof, a sound like someone tapping a key on a table, patient and regular. She stood up. Her knees cracked. She folded the letter carefully and tucked it into her coat pocket, beside the 1988 photograph. She picked up the brass key. She took the candle off the desk. She walked back down the narrow stairs to the second floor, past the hallway, past the locked door, to the room where Emma slept. She sat on the edge of the bed. She watched her daughter sleep. Emma's small chest rose and fell. The flicker of the candle caught the silver of the dried tear tracks on her cheeks. Rachel set the brass key on the small wooden table. She did not go down to the basement. Not tonight. Not in the dark, alone, at almost 11 o'clock at night, in a building she did not know, with only a candle and a cheap flashlight on a phone that was already down to 18% battery. She would do it tomorrow, in the light, when Emma was awake and could stay in the room with a book while Rachel went down to see. Because if James Coleman Jr. had been telling the truth, and if the letter was real, and if there was in fact a steel door in the basement with a combination lock that opened to the date October 14, 1923, then tomorrow morning Rachel Coleman was going to find out whether or not her life had just changed. And she was not going to find out alone. She was going to find out in the daylight, with her daughter upstairs safe, with her phone charged, with a clear head and a plan. She blew out the candle. She lay down beside Emma. She pulled the blankets over both of them. The building was cold and damp, but Emma's small body was warm against her side, and Mr. Peanut's plastic nose was pressing into Rachel's shoulder, and Rachel closed her eyes, and she did not sleep, not for hours, but she did not cry either, because crying was not what tonight called for. Tonight called for holding her daughter. Tonight called for listening to the wind in the tin of the roof, and the far-off sound of a freight train moving through Millbrook the way freight trains had moved through Millbrook every night since the railroad had come in 1874, and thinking about what it might mean that a man named James Coleman Sr. had opened a store on this street 101 years ago, and that his son had left a letter behind for her, or for someone like her, or for no one at all, and that she had been the one to find it. When she finally slept, it was after 3 a.m., and she dreamed, for the first time in 2 years and 4 months, of David. He was standing on the front porch of 4411 Millbrook Street, the house they had lost that morning, and he was waving her in, and he was smiling, and he was saying something she couldn't quite hear over the sound of the wind. In the morning, before Emma was awake, Rachel sat up in the dark and reached into her coat pocket, and she felt for the letter and the photograph and the brass key. They were all still there. She pulled them out and held them in her hand in the pre-dawn gray light that was starting to show through the plywood over the windows, and she looked at them for a long time. And she understood, slowly, the way you understand a thing when you are exhausted and out of options and running on nothing but love for a small person who needs you, that whatever happened today was going to happen. She had bought this building for $6. Whatever was in it, for good or for bad, was now hers. She got out of bed. She put on her boots. She pulled her coat tight against the cold. She left a note for Emma on the wooden table, in case her daughter woke up before she got back. "Baby, I'm just downstairs looking at the building. Stay here. I'll be right back. Love, Mom." And then Rachel Coleman, who 3 hours earlier had been a homeless widow with $37 in her checking account, picked up the brass key from the table, lit her second-to-last candle, and went down the narrow stairs in search of a door that had been waiting for her for 36 years. The main floor of the building looked different in the gray pre-dawn light than it had looked the night before. Less menacing. Smaller. The shapes that had been shadows last night resolved into things that were just things: a leaning shelf, a broken chair, a pile of old newspapers bundled with twine. Rachel moved through the old storefront with the candle held low, her eyes sweeping the floor for the basement access. She found it behind the counter, a square trapdoor set into the hardwood with a recessed iron ring. She squatted down and pulled the ring. The trapdoor was heavier than she expected, but it came up, releasing a breath of colder, damper air that smelled like river mud and something metallic she couldn't place. A wooden staircase descended into darkness. Rachel held the candle over the opening. The stairs looked solid, built of thick pine that had been oiled at some point in the last century. She tested the top step with her boot. It held. She descended, one hand on the wall for balance, the candle trembling in the other. The basement was smaller than the main floor, maybe 20 by 20, with a low ceiling and a packed dirt floor. Stone foundation walls, the original limestone and mortar that the Coleman brothers had laid in 1923. A coal furnace in one corner, long dead, its iron feed door hanging open. Wooden crates stacked against one wall, some of them broken open, empty. An old workbench with a vise still clamped to it, and rust flaking off everything in long orange strips. And at the back, set into the north wall, a steel door. Rachel walked toward it slowly, the candle held out in front of her. The door was exactly what James Coleman Jr. had described. Heavy steel, painted black, the paint bubbling and peeling with age. A brass handle, a keyhole that looked like it required a specific, old-fashioned key. And below the keyhole, built directly into the door itself, a combination dial of the kind she had seen in old bank vaults, the numbers etched in brass, the dial worn smooth where thumbs had turned it hundreds, maybe thousands of times over the decades. She stood in front of the door and held her breath. For a long moment, she did not reach for the key in her pocket. She was afraid, and she could admit that to herself now, here in the cold quiet of the basement with the candle flickering. She was afraid of what was behind this door, and she was afraid of what wasn't behind it. She was afraid that the letter was a joke, that the hidden drawer was a joke, that her life had been reduced to the kind of hope that a desperate person scraped together in the middle of the night from whatever scraps the universe handed them. She was afraid that she would open this door and find an empty room, or worse, a room filled with the kind of disappointment that would strip her of the one small flame of something that was almost hope, and leave her and Emma in the same condition they'd been in at 4 p.m. yesterday, only colder and with less candle. But then she thought about Emma. She thought about the note on the table upstairs. She thought about her daughter, asleep under a pile of blankets in a condemned building, whose mother had brought her here because her mother was out of other options. And she thought, if there is nothing behind this door, then there is nothing behind this door, and I will figure out what to do next, the way I have figured out what to do next every single day since David died. And if there is something behind this door, then I will deal with that, too. She pulled the brass key from her pocket. She fitted into the lock. It turned with a sound that was surprisingly smooth, like the lock had been oiled more recently than anything else in the building. She heard the bolt retract. She did not pull the handle. Not yet. She took the combination dial in her fingers, and she turned it to 10, and then back to 14, and then to 23. She heard a second bolt retract, deeper inside the door, a longer slide of metal on metal that traveled the full width of the frame. She set the candle on the workbench. She took the brass handle in both hands. She pulled. The door did not open. It resisted, stuck in its frame after 36 years of disuse. Rachel braced her boot against the foundation wall and pulled harder, and then harder still, and finally something gave with a sound like a seal breaking, and the door swung outward on hinges that groaned but did not break. Beyond the door was a small antechamber, maybe 6 feet by 6 feet, lined in concrete that was newer than the limestone foundation around it. A second door stood at the far end of this chamber, painted the same black as the first. But this second door had no combination lock, just a simple metal handle, the kind you'd see on a closet door. Rachel picked up the candle. She stepped into the antechamber. The air inside was dry, remarkably dry, given the damp of the basement behind her. She could feel the difference on her skin. Whoever had built this chamber had built it well, had sealed it against the moisture of an Ohio basement, had designed it to keep whatever was inside from rotting or rusting or molding. That more than anything convinced her that James Coleman Jr.'s letter had not been a joke. Nobody built a room like this as a prank. She walked to the second door. She put her hand on the handle. She turned it. The door opened. She held the candle up, and she stepped inside, and she looked at what was in the room, and she did not move, and she did not speak, and for a full count of 10 she did not even breathe. Then she turned around, very carefully, and she walked back out of the room, and back through the antechamber, and back into the basement, and up the wooden staircase, and across the main floor, and up the narrow stairs to the second floor, and down the hallway to the room where her daughter was sleeping. She sat on the edge of the bed. She looked at Emma's face in the faint light coming through the plywood. She put her hand on her daughter's back and felt the small, steady rise and fall of her breathing. And only then, sitting in the dark beside her sleeping child, did Rachel Coleman allow herself to begin, very quietly, to cry. She cried for about a minute, maybe less. She wiped her face with her sleeve. She took a deep breath. She stood up, and she went back down to the basement, because what she had seen in that room needed to be looked at again, carefully, with a working phone and a clear head, and she needed to do it before Emma woke up. Because what she had seen in that room, in the quick sweep of a single candle flame, had been shelves. Rows and rows of wooden shelves, floor to ceiling, covering 3 walls of a chamber that was bigger than it had seemed at first glance, maybe 15 feet by 20, and on those shelves, stacked in neat and organized rows, had been objects. Boxes, ledgers, a gun cabinet, paintings wrapped in heavy brown paper, leather-bound portfolios, a low wooden safe, the old-fashioned kind with a wheel, sitting in the center of the floor. And in the far corner, barely visible in the candle's light, what had looked unmistakably, impossibly, like stacks of small canvas bags, the kind that had been used 100 years ago by banks and by merchants to hold coins. Rachel went back down. This time she turned on her phone's flashlight, which was more powerful than the candle, and she walked into the inner chamber with her pulse pounding in her ears and her free hand pressed against her chest like she was trying to hold her heart inside her rib cage by physical force. She swept the light slowly from left to right, and the room, which had been a brief, impossible flicker a few minutes ago, now held still long enough for her to really see it. James Coleman Sr., who had built Coleman Brothers Dry Goods in 1923 and run it until his death in 1971, had not trusted banks. His son had written that in the letter. And now Rachel, standing in the dry concrete vault her grandfather-in-law. If she was right about the Coleman connection, which she was starting to think she might be, and if she wasn't, then some other long-dead man she had no claim on, had built into the basement of his store, was looking at what that distrust had accumulated over 48 years of careful, patient, private wealth. The canvas bags in the corner were not empty. She walked over and lifted one. It was heavy, too heavy. She set it on the wooden safe and untied the drawstring and shined her phone into the bag, and the light came back at her in the gold yellow of metal that had never tarnished because pure metal doesn't tarnish. Coins. Gold coins. She poured a few into her palm. They were St. Gaudens double eagles, the kind she had seen once at an estate sale she'd gone to with David in the first year of their marriage when he had been going through a phase of wanting to collect things. She didn't know their exact value. She knew it was a lot. David had said, back then, that a single St. Gaudens in good condition was worth $5,000, at least. She had the coins under the light now, and she could see the dates. 1907, 1908, 1924, 1928. There had to be 40 or 50 coins in the bag in her hand, and there were dozens of bags. She put the coins back. She tied the drawstring. She set the bag down carefully. She turned her flashlight to the shelves. The leather-bound portfolios turned out to be stock certificates. Original paper certificates, the kind nobody issued anymore, for companies with names like Ohio Edison, Republic Steel, Standard Oil of Indiana, General Motors. The dates on the certificates ranged from 1924 through 1969. Some of the certificates bore the names of companies that Rachel didn't recognize, probably defunct, probably worthless now. Others were for companies she knew had survived, had been bought out, had turned into pieces of larger corporations whose stock was still traded today. She didn't know what any of it was worth. She knew, because David had taught her this much about their own retirement account, that old paper stock certificates for companies that still existed in some form could often be traced, through a process she didn't understand, back to current holdings. Sometimes those holdings were small. Sometimes they were not. The paintings, when she unwrapped the corner of the top one just enough to see, were oil paintings. Landscapes, mostly. She did not know art. She did not know painters. She could see the signatures, but the names meant nothing to her. But she could see that the canvases were old, and that the frames were expensive, and that someone, at some point, had cared enough about these paintings to wrap them carefully in acid-free paper and store them in a climate-controlled vault. And people did not do that with paintings that were worth nothing. The gun cabinet held half a dozen hunting rifles and shotguns, old and probably valuable to collectors, but Rachel felt a wave of something like relief when she saw them locked in place, because she did not want guns to be part of what was happening. She moved on. The ledgers on the middle shelf were the most carefully organized thing in the room. They were labeled by year, in the same handwriting Rachel was now starting to recognize as James Coleman Sr.'s, 1924, 1925, 1926, all the way through 1969. 2 years after 1969 he had died. The ledgers, she understood, were inventories. Every asset he had ever placed in this vault, cataloged by date of acquisition, source, purchase price, and description. She opened the 1935 ledger at random. Gold Eagle, 1907, mint condition, purchased March 14th from Hoffman Estate sale, $22.00. She closed it. She did not need to read the ledgers right now. She needed to sit down. She needed to think. She sat down on the cold concrete floor of the vault, with her back against the wooden safe, and she pressed her hands over her face, and she laughed. Just once. A small, hoarse, astonished laugh. It came out sounding more like a sob, but she was pretty sure it was a laugh. Then she got up, and she closed the inner door, and she walked back out through the antechamber, and she spun the combination dial back to where it had been, and she locked the outer steel door with the brass key, and she put the key in the inside pocket of her jeans, the deepest pocket she had, and she climbed the basement stairs and closed the trapdoor and went back upstairs to the room where her daughter was sleeping. It was 6:42 a.m. The sky outside, past the edges of the plywood, had begun to turn the color of a dirty dishcloth. Emma stirred and mumbled something and rolled over, her arm finding Mr. Peanut in her sleep. Rachel sat down on the edge of the bed. She watched her daughter sleep. She did not touch her. She did not want to wake her. She wanted, for maybe 5 more minutes, to sit in the quiet with the knowledge of what was in the basement and not have to decide yet what to do about it. Because this was not, Rachel understood, a simple thing. This was not the kind of thing where you just walked out of your building with a bag of gold coins and started a new life. The coins had to be real. She didn't fully trust that they were, not yet, not without an expert looking at them. The stock certificates had to be traceable. The paintings had to be appraised. The building itself had to be legally clear, which, as a surplus auction property sold as is, she thought it probably was, but she couldn't be sure. And she was, at this moment, sitting in a condemned building that the city had sold her for $6, and she had no money, and she had no lawyer, and she had a daughter who was going to wake up in an hour and need breakfast, and a bathroom, and a reason to believe that her mother was still the person in charge of keeping her safe. She was going to have to be careful. She was going to have to be smart. She was going to have to protect what was in that basement, because if word got out, if the city figured out what had been in the building when they'd auctioned it off, if anyone with more power than Rachel Coleman decided to start asking questions about a $14,000 tax lien and a $6 sale price and a vault full of St. Gaudens gold coins, then everything she had found in that basement could disappear back into the hands of people who didn't need it the way she needed it. The first thing she needed was a lawyer. A good one. Not a criminal lawyer, not a family lawyer, but a property lawyer who understood estate issues and abandoned assets and surplus auction law. She didn't know how she was going to pay for one, but she thought that maybe, If she was honest and open about what she'd found, a property lawyer would be willing to work on contingency, the way David had said lawyers sometimes worked for accident cases. She would figure that out today. The second thing she needed was to keep the building a secret. Not the fact that she owned it, that was public record, that would be in the county clerk's office by next week, but the fact that she was living in it, and the fact of what was in the basement. Those things, she understood, needed to stay inside the walls of this building for as long as possible, which meant that when the sun came up, she was going to have to go out and buy a better padlock for the front door, a real one, and some plywood for the windows that didn't have it. And she was going to have to make it look from the outside like the building was what everyone thought it was, a condemned dump, empty and unloved. The third thing she needed was for Emma to be okay. That was the only thing that really mattered. Everything else was in service of that. Rachel reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the photograph. Dad, Mom, Jimmy and Bobby, 1988. She looked at the faces. The father, James Coleman Sr., who she was now almost certain was somehow related to David, somehow related to Emma, because the older of the two boys in the photograph, Jimmy, had a set to his jaw and a shape to his eyes that was exactly, uncannily, David's. The same jaw Rachel had watched set itself at David's father's funeral, when David had been 12 according to the family stories, the same shape of eyes Emma had now. She did not know yet how the line ran. She did not know if David had been a great-nephew of these men, a cousin twice removed, something more distant. But she knew, looking at that old photograph in the gray November dawn of a condemned building, that the Coleman brothers had not been strangers. James Coleman Jr. had written in his letter that he and his brother Robert had been the last of the Coleman line. He had been wrong about that. He had not known, in 1988, that somewhere in the same small town, a cousin or a great-cousin or a grandson of someone who had quietly slipped out of the family records was raising a boy named David, who would grow up and marry a woman named Rachel, and that those two would have a daughter named Emma, and that Emma would sleep one night in this building with her mother, and that her mother would find the letter and the key and the door, and what lay beyond it. Mom, Emma said, from the bed. She was awake. She was rubbing her eyes. Mom, are you okay? You look weird. Rachel wiped her face, which was wet again, which was strange because she hadn't felt herself crying this time. I'm okay, baby. I'm fine. Why are you crying? I'm not crying. I think maybe I'm smiling. It's just been a while. Emma considered this. She sat up in the nest of blankets. Mr. Peanut dangled from one hand. Do I have to go to school today? Rachel laughed for real this time. No, honey. You don't have to go to school today. Are we still in the old building? Yes. Is it still ours? Rachel thought about the vault, about the gold coins, about the paintings, about the ledgers, about everything she had seen in the last 30 minutes, and everything she was going to have to do in the next 30 days to protect it and understand it and figure out how to turn it into a life for herself and her daughter. Yes, baby, she said. It's still ours. It's all still ours. Emma nodded, accepting this as she accepted most things lately, with a grave, tired calm that Rachel had come to associate with a kind of grief she did not know how to undo. Emma climbed out of the bed and hugged Mr. Peanut against her chest. Can we have breakfast now? Yeah, we can have breakfast. Rachel made peanut butter sandwiches on the small wooden table, and she poured the last of the milk into Emma's measuring cup glass, and they ate together on the edge of the bed while the gray morning light grew brighter around the edges of the plywood. Emma talked about Mr. Peanut's theories about the building. Mr. Peanut thought there might be a ghost in it. Mr. Peanut thought the ghost was probably friendly. Mr. Peanut thought the ghost might be lonely after so many years and might like some company. Rachel listened, and she nodded, and she made appropriate noises at the appropriate times, and in her coat pocket the brass key lay heavy against her hip, and in her chest something she could not quite name was beginning, slowly and carefully, to move. When they had finished eating, Rachel pulled Emma into her lap and held her for a long time. Emma did not protest. Emma leaned her small head against her mother's shoulder and stayed there. Mom, Emma said eventually. Yeah, baby. Mrs. Dalworth said something yesterday when we were putting the bags in the car. Rachel went still. What did she say, honey? She said it was a shame what happened. She said some people just weren't cut out to be homeowners. She said it to her friend. She didn't say it to me, but I heard it. Rachel closed her eyes. She pictured Mrs. Dalworth standing at her side of the fence, watching them carry their garbage bags of clothes to the Accord. She pictured her own face, her attempt to keep it neutral, to not cry in front of the neighbors. She pictured the locksmith's truck at the curb. She pictured the small audience of the street. 2 houses down, Carl Henderson watching from his living room window. The Patels, across the street from the Dalworths, carrying their groceries in with their eyes carefully averted. The Wilsons' teenage son on his bike at the end of the block, slowing down as he passed. All of them watching. All of them thinking some version of whatever Mrs. Dalworth had said out loud. Some people just weren't cut out to be homeowners. Some people were not cut out to manage their own money. Some people brought it on themselves. Some people made bad choices. Some people, if you looked closely enough, deserved what they got. And none of those people, Rachel thought, had known her husband David. None of them had sat in the ICU for 9 days with the chaplain. None of them had made the decision about the ventilator at 3:14 on a Tuesday afternoon. None of them had come home to a mailbox full of medical bills for a man who had been dead for a month. Bills that were now her bills because the insurance had fought every claim for 2 years and the hospital had eventually sent a debt collector. None of them had watched the severance run out, the savings run out, the credit run out. None of them had spent the last 6 months sending out resumes and being told, politely and impolitely, that they were almost qualified, almost a fit, almost the right person, almost enough. Rachel opened her eyes. She looked at her daughter, who was watching her face carefully. Mrs. Dalworth, she said, slowly, was wrong. About what? About pretty much everything. Emma nodded. Emma's face, in that moment, was not the face of an 8-year-old. It was the face of a person who had been paying attention for a long time. Mom, Emma said, are we going to be okay? Rachel thought about the basement, about the key in her pocket, about the 36 years the door had waited, about the letter from James Coleman Jr., and the photograph of a family in 1988 that might, impossibly, be her daughter's family. She thought about Emma's question, which was the same question Emma had asked her every single night for 28 months, sometimes out loud, sometimes just with her eyes, and which Rachel had answered the same way every single time. Yes, baby, we are going to be okay, because that was what you said to your child whether you believed it or not. She thought about saying it again, the way she had said it 1,000 times. Instead, this time, she said something different. Emma, I think we might actually be. Emma looked at her for a long moment. And then, very slowly, for the first time in 28 months, Emma smiled at her mother the way Emma had used to smile, the big, whole, uncomplicated smile she had been born with, the smile she had lost on a Tuesday night in the ICU, and which Rachel had not seen since. Okay, Mom, Emma said. Okay. Rachel kissed the top of her daughter's head. She held her for a little longer. Outside, the November sun was rising over Millbrook Street, over the roof of the house across the way that they did not live in anymore, over the neighbors who had watched them leave, over the small dying town that had once been a place where a man named James Coleman Sr. had opened a dry goods store 101 years ago, and had spent the next 48 years of his life quietly saving things, piece by piece, in a vault in his basement, for reasons known only to him. In the coat pocket against Rachel's hip, the brass key lay warm now from her body heat, and very, very patient. She had a lot of work to do. The first decision Rachel made that morning was about the Accord. She had a quarter tank of gas, and she had $37 in her checking account, and she had one phone call to make, and she was not going to make it from inside the condemned building because she did not want any signal or any record tying her phone to 4412 Millbrook Street any more than it already was. She told Emma to stay in the room with her books and Mr. Peanut, and she locked both the steel back door and the front door as best she could, and she drove the Accord to the public library 2 miles east on Route 6. The library had free Wi-Fi, a bathroom with actual running water where Emma could have washed up if she'd been with her, a small community bulletin board, and, most importantly, privacy. Rachel parked in the far corner of the lot, where the cameras didn't reach, and she pulled up her phone's browser and she started typing. Property lawyer, Millbrook, Ohio. Estate attorney, contingency basis. Abandoned asset claims. She read every listing carefully. Most of the property lawyers in the area were the kind who did house closings and refinances. A few did wills and trusts. What she wanted was someone who understood surplus auctions, quiet title actions, and the very specific weirdness of what happened when a property was sold by a municipality with unknown contents. She scrolled for 30 minutes. She ruled out 3 large firms because she knew, instinctively, that a large firm would look at her and see someone who could not pay. She ruled out 2 sole practitioners whose websites looked like they had been made in 1998. And then, on page 3 of the search results, she found a name. Theodore Marsh, attorney at law, Marsh Legal LLC, Sandusky. Practice areas: real property, quiet title, estate recovery, surplus auctions. 23 years of practice. One-man firm. Google reviews that ran the gamut from Ted saved my family's farm to unconventional but got the job done. He was 40 minutes away. He was not the closest option, but he was the only one whose website specifically mentioned the phrase sold as is and the intricacies of post-sale disputes. She called the number. A woman with a smoker's voice answered on the 3rd ring, identified herself as Donna, and asked what the call was regarding. Rachel said she was hoping to speak with Mr. Marsh about a property she had recently acquired at a municipal auction. Donna asked if it was urgent. Rachel, careful, said yes. Donna said Mr. Marsh had a 10:30 opening. Rachel looked at the dashboard clock. It was 8:47. She said she would be there. Donna said, bring the paperwork, whatever paperwork you have. Rachel hung up, and she drove back to the building, and she loaded Emma into the Accord because she was not leaving her daughter alone in a condemned building, not for 40 minutes each way and an hour-long consultation, not ever. She told Emma they were going on a little road trip. Emma, who had learned over the last 6 months to accept the unexplained movements of her mother's life with a kind of resigned patience that hurt Rachel every time she witnessed it, nodded and got in the car with Mr. Peanut and a library book about horses. The drive to Sandusky gave Rachel 40 minutes to think. She thought about what she was going to tell Mr. Marsh and what she was going to hold back and how to frame the question in a way that did not make her sound like a person who had gone slowly insane. She thought about the letter in her coat pocket. She thought about the key. She thought about the ledger page she had photographed with her phone, the 1935 entry, Hoffman estate sale, $22 for a gold eagle that she was pretty sure was worth something on the order of $2,000 today. She thought about Emma beside her, reading about horses, oblivious. And she thought, as she sometimes thought when she was driving alone and the road was long, about David. About what David would have said if he could see her right now. David, who had been a high school history teacher, who had been the steady one in their marriage, the one who worked things out on paper before he made decisions. David would have told her to slow down, to document everything, to find a lawyer who could be trusted. He would have told her not to panic. He would have told her, with that half-smile he used to have, that she was smarter than she gave herself credit for, and that she had always been the one who kept the ship afloat when storms came. He would have told her, Rach, you've got this. She put her hand on the passenger seat. It was empty except for a folder of the paperwork she had grabbed that morning. But the gesture felt like something she needed to do anyway. Marsh Legal LLC occupied the 2nd floor of a converted bungalow on East Washington Street in downtown Sandusky. There was no elevator. Rachel carried Emma's backpack up the narrow staircase. The office at the top of the stairs smelled like old books and strong coffee and the faint ghost of cigarette smoke that had been illegal in office buildings for a decade, but that some older lawyers apparently still committed quietly in their back rooms. Donna, the smoker's voice on the phone, turned out to be a woman in her late 60s with reading glasses on a chain and the expression of someone who had seen every version of every story a small-town lawyer could be told. She took one look at Rachel and at Emma holding Mr. Peanut, and her face softened in a way that surprised Rachel, because by this point she had stopped expecting faces to soften for her. Go on back, honey. Ted's free. Your little one can sit in the waiting room with me. I've got coloring books and juice boxes. Emma, who was normally shy with strangers, looked up at Donna and said, Do you have horse coloring books? Donna produced, from a drawer behind her desk, a coloring book about horses that looked like it had been waiting in that drawer for a very long time. Rachel felt, for a moment, like she might cry again. She did not. She went back. Theodore Marsh was in his late 50s, a heavy-set man with a silver beard and reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and a cardigan over a button-down that had seen many washings. His office was cluttered in the way that offices of working lawyers are always cluttered, stacked with folders and deposition boxes and legal pads and a coffee cup that said "World's Best Grandpa" on it. He did not have a suit jacket on. He did not stand up when she walked in. He gestured to the chair across from his desk and said, "Sit. Coffee?" "No, thank you. Tell me why you're here." And Rachel, who had rehearsed a careful, controlled version of her situation on the drive up, looked at his face, which was tired and patient and a little skeptical and not at all unkind, and she decided in that moment that she was going to tell him the truth. All of it. Because she was done trying to manage other people's perceptions of her, and because she could not afford, at this point in her life, to hire a lawyer she had to lie to. She told him everything. Her husband dying, the hospital bills, the job loss, the foreclosure, the accord, the library Wi-Fi, the auction listing at 3:14 p.m. the day before, the $6 purchase, the first night in the building, the photograph above the bed, the rolltop desk on the third floor, the letter from James Coleman Jr., the key, the steel door in the basement, the combination October 14th, 23, and what was behind the inner door, the canvas bags, the St. Gaudens, the portfolios, the ledgers. She took the letter out of her coat pocket and she put it on his desk. She took the photograph out and she put it on his desk. She took her phone out and she showed him the pictures she had taken that morning of the vault interior. She showed him the 1935 ledger entry. She kept talking even when her voice started to shake, which it did about halfway through, and when she was finished, she sat very still with her hands in her lap, and she waited for him to tell her that she was either delusional or that she was about to lose everything she had just found. Theodore Marsh did not say anything for a long time. He read the letter. He read it twice. He picked up the photograph and looked at it under his desk lamp. He looked at her photos on her phone, swiping through them slowly, one at a time, zooming in on the canvas bags and on the ledger page. He rubbed his beard. He took off his reading glasses, and then he put them on again. He got up and walked to his window and looked out at East Washington Street for about a minute. And then he sat back down, and he looked at her, and he said one sentence. "Mrs. Coleman, I believe you." Rachel exhaled and discovered that she had been holding her breath since she had handed him the letter. "I believe you," he said again, "because I have practiced law in this part of Ohio for 23 years, and I have seen many surplus auction cases, and I have never seen one quite like this. And I have also never, in my life, seen a woman walk into my office and tell me a story this strange while looking me in the eye the whole time. Which tells me you're not lying. It also tells me we have a problem." "What kind of problem?" "The kind where, once word gets out about what's in that basement, the city of Millbrook is going to send somebody over with a thick envelope of legal documents trying to claim that the vault was not part of the property conveyance. The kind where a distant relative of the Coleman brothers, if any exists, is going to materialize out of the woodwork with a lawyer. The kind where the state of Ohio Department of Taxation will start asking questions. The kind where, if you are not extremely careful, you could lose everything in that basement to people with better lawyers than you can afford and more political connections than you have, and all of it will happen legally, quietly, and without anyone ever telling you until the paperwork arrives." He leaned forward. "But here is what I want you to understand, Mrs. Coleman. You did not do anything wrong. You bought a property at a municipal auction, sold as is, for $6, plus a tax lien that you legally assumed. You paid that money. The city accepted that money. The deed has been filed, or will be filed within 10 business days. Everything inside the walls of that property, at the moment of conveyance, became yours. That is the law. That is not me giving you an optimistic interpretation. That is the Ohio Revised Code, Title 53, on the conveyance of real and personal property by municipal tax sale. If the city failed to inspect the interior of the property before auctioning it, that is their mistake, not yours. The only way they can claw back what is in that basement is if we make mistakes between now and then." Rachel's hands were shaking. She put them under the desk. "What do I have to do?" "First thing, you do not remove anything from that vault. Not one coin, not one certificate, not one painting. Not today, not tomorrow, not until I tell you it is safe. The moment you move anything off the property, the chain of custody becomes unclear. We need everything to remain in place, documented, photographed, inventoried, but undisturbed, so that when the inevitable challenge comes, we can show that you found these assets in the building on the day you took possession, exactly as they had been for decades." "Okay, Second thing, nobody knows about that vault. Nobody. Not your mother, not your best friend, not the neighbor who smiles at you, not the nurse at the clinic. Nobody. You go home today, you secure that building, and you do not speak of the basement to another human being who is not me or a professional I have personally cleared. Understood? Understood. Third, I need to come to the property. Today. This afternoon, if you can manage it. I need to see the vault with my own eyes. I need to take my own photographs, my own notes, my own initial appraisal. And I need to bring one other person I trust, a man named Curtis Delaney who used to be a curator at the Toledo Museum of Art and who now does private appraisals for estates and insurance claims. Curtis is discreet, he is accurate, and he is fast. He is also a personal friend, and he will not charge you a dime for the first look. That is my promise and his favor to me. I can't pay you either. Not right now. I have $37. Marsh waved his hand. Mrs. Coleman, do you really think I am going to charge you hourly for a case like this? I will take 10% of whatever we successfully establish as legally yours. Contingency. Standard contract. I will draw it up this afternoon. If we lose, I lose. If we win, we both win. 10% is fair given the complexity. I could ask for 15, I could ask for 20. Some lawyers would. I am not going to. We will also draw up a second agreement that holds back a small emergency fund from the initial liquidation, $5,000, for you and your daughter to live on while this case proceeds. You cannot fight a legal battle from a condemned building on $37. That is not realistic and it is not fair. Rachel stared at him. Why are you doing this? He took off his glasses and he looked at her for a long moment with tired eyes. Mrs. Coleman, I have been doing this a long time. Most of what comes through my door is the small machinery of other people's misery. Boundary disputes, divorces, lien foreclosures. Every once in a while, maybe once every 5 or 7 years, somebody walks in with something that is actually interesting. And about half those times, they are also somebody who genuinely needs help. You are both. I am doing this because I like my job when I get to do it for real, and because my wife will be extremely annoyed with me if I come home tonight and tell her I turned down a widow with a daughter who just slept in a condemned building. Donna will set up the appointment. Drive carefully. I will see you at 3. He came at 3, as promised. He brought Curtis Delaney, who was a thin man in his 60s with the precise manner of a person who had spent his life examining objects very carefully. Curtis brought a leather briefcase full of tools Rachel did not recognize, and a pair of cotton gloves, and a loop, and a portable UV light. They spent 4 hours in the vault. Rachel stayed upstairs with Emma, because Marsh had said, gently, that it was better for her not to be in the room while the initial survey was happening, so that there could be no later question of contamination or alteration. She read Emma 3 chapters of the horse book. She made peanut butter sandwiches for everyone. Curtis, when he emerged from the basement at 7:14 p.m., took one look at the peanut butter sandwich she offered him and said, in a tone of great dignity, Mrs. Coleman, that would be lovely. Thank you. He and Marsh sat at the small wooden table in the second-floor apartment. Emma sat on the bed with Mr. Peanut, pretending to read but listening. Rachel did not have the heart to send her daughter out of the room. Preliminary assessment, Curtis said, in the careful voice of a man who was being cautious. And I emphasize preliminary. Formal appraisal will require a controlled environment, better lighting, and several weeks of work. But based on what I have seen today, I can give you ranges. Please, Rachel said. The coins are real. All of them, or very close to all of them. There are approximately 1,400 St. Gaudens double eagles, of which I examined roughly 200. The ones I examined were in condition ranging from fine to mint state 65. Some are key dates. There are also approximately 300 Liberty Head $20 coins and roughly 800 various silver dollars, including Morgans from the San Francisco and Carson City mints, as well as peace dollars in excellent condition. There are additionally some foreign gold pieces, British sovereigns, French Napoleons, and a small but significant collection of Mexican eight escudo pieces from the 18th century. Those last are, frankly, astonishing. The total metallic value of the coin hoard, at current spot prices for gold and silver, is somewhere in the range of $11 to $13 million. The collector value, which is significantly higher, will depend on the condition of each individual coin, but my rough estimate, and it is rough, places the full numismatic value of the collection between $38 and $55 million. Rachel did not move. She did not breathe. Emma, on the bed, was no longer pretending to read. The paintings, Curtis continued, as if he had not just said the words $38 and $55 million, are more complex. There are 14 oil paintings in the vault. 12 of them are American landscapes from the period 1880 to 1940. Of those 12, I can tentatively identify the hands of several known painters, including one piece that I am almost certain is by George Inness, and a smaller piece that, if authentic, is a William Merritt Chase. The Inness, if confirmed, is in the $3 to $5 million range. The Chase, perhaps $800,000 to $1.2 million. The other 10 American pieces are worth somewhere between $30,000 and $200,000 each. The two remaining paintings are more unusual. One is a European work, possibly Dutch, possibly 17th century, possibly much more valuable than anything else in the vault. I cannot say more without further examination. The other is a small portrait, signed with initials I do not recognize, which may be worth very little or may be worth a great deal, depending on who the initials belong to. Total preliminary range for the paintings, $9 to $18 million, with significant upside if certain attributions are confirmed. Rachel was beginning to feel lightheaded. The stock certificates, Curtis said, and now he looked at Marsh, are where we are going to need specialized help. There are roughly 400 individual certificates in 12 bound portfolios. The dates range from 1924 to 1969. Many of them are for companies that no longer exist, which unfortunately means they are worth only their paper value, which is to say, very little. However, a significant percentage, perhaps 30 to 40%, are for companies that survived, either intact or through mergers and acquisitions. Tracing those certificates through subsequent corporate histories, determining stock splits, dividend reinvestment, if applicable, and current equivalent holdings, is a specialized area of practice. I would estimate conservatively that the traceable certificates represent a current market value of between $60 and $120 million, though the higher end assumes successful claims on long-held dividends that have been sitting in corporate trusts for many decades. This is where your attorney will need to work carefully. Marsh nodded, making notes on his legal pad. The guns, Curtis said, are mostly of modest value, perhaps $15,000 across the cabinet, with the exception of one item, an engraved Parker Brothers shotgun from the 1920s, which is of considerable collector interest and may bring $30,000 or $40,000 at auction on its own. What about the safe? Marsh asked. Yes, the safe. I did not open the safe. I lacked the equipment and the authority. Mrs. Coleman, do you have any indication of the combination for the central safe? No. Then we will deal with that later. In my experience with estate safes of that era, what is inside is often either extremely valuable or extremely personal, and sometimes both. We should not speculate. He folded his hands on the table. He looked at Rachel. Mrs. Coleman, in aggregate, the preliminary total for the contents of the vault, not counting the safe, is between $120 million and $210 million, with a most likely midpoint somewhere in the range of $150 to $170 million. These numbers are preliminary. They are estimates. Formal appraisals will move these numbers, probably upward in some categories and downward in others, but they will not move them by an order of magnitude. What you have in that basement is, to put it in blunt terms, a very large fortune. Nobody spoke for about 10 seconds. Then Emma, very quietly, said, Mom. Rachel turned to her daughter. Emma was sitting on the bed with Mr. Peanut in her lap, and her brown eyes, which were David's eyes, were very wide. Mom, $120 million is a lot. Rachel laughed. She could not help it. She laughed until her eyes streamed. Curtis Delaney, with great dignity, handed her a handkerchief from his pocket. Marsh, after a moment, laughed too. Even Curtis smiled, which Rachel suspected was a rare thing for him. Emma watched all of this with the grave solemnity of an 8-year-old who had just learned that her mother might not be crazy after all. Yeah, baby, Rachel said, finally getting herself under control. $120 million is a lot. The next 3 weeks were the strangest of Rachel's life. She did not sell anything. She did not remove anything. She stayed in the building with Emma, and she secured the doors with new deadbolts that Marsh had recommended, and she installed a basic security system with a motion sensor and a camera pointed at the front door, which Marsh had paid for out of his own pocket and which he had told her she could reimburse him for later. She drove Emma to school each morning, 40 minutes south to a district office that had enrolled Emma as a transfer student on an emergency basis, with a school address listed as temporary housing to be updated. And she picked Emma up each afternoon, and she fed them both from the groceries she bought with the $5,000 Marsh had advanced her against future settlements. She did not tell anyone where they were living. Not Aunt Linda. Not her old nursing supervisor. Not her mother, who lived in Arizona and who would have wanted to drive across the country if she'd known. Nobody. But word got out anyway. It was always going to get out. The city clerk, a man named Harold Winters, had apparently mentioned to his wife that a young woman had bought 4412 Millbrook Street for $6, and his wife had apparently mentioned it to her sister, who worked in the mayor's office, and within 10 days the question was circulating around Millbrook of why, exactly, the city had sold a condemned 4-story commercial building for $6, and who had bought it, and what she intended to do with it. On the afternoon of December 6th, Rachel came back from picking Emma up at school to find a man standing on the sidewalk in front of the building. He was maybe 65, tall, thin, wearing a gray wool overcoat that cost more than the Accord, with a face that was clean-shaven and weathered in the way of men who spent time outdoors for leisure rather than for work. He looked at Rachel. She looked at him. Emma, in the back seat, looked at both of them. "Mrs. Coleman?" he said. Rachel rolled the window down a few inches. "Yes. My name is Philip Coleman. I'm James Coleman Jr.'s nephew." He held out a business card through the gap in the window. His voice was very polite. "I wonder if we might speak." Rachel took the card. Her hand was not quite steady. The card read Philip R. Coleman, Investments, with a Chicago address and a phone number. She looked at his face. There was something in it. Not the exact set of the jaw she had seen in the 1988 photograph, but something adjacent, something that suggested a kinship at 1 or 2 removes. She thought of David's eyes in the photo. She thought of Emma's eyes, now, in the rearview mirror. She thought of what Marsh had said. A distant relative of the Coleman brothers, if any exists, is going to materialize out of the woodwork with a lawyer. "Mr. Coleman," Rachel said carefully, "I would be happy to speak with you, but not today and not here. If you would like to meet, I would ask that you contact my attorney, Mr. Theodore Marsh in Sandusky. He will arrange a time and place." Philip Coleman did not look surprised. He nodded, as though this was exactly the answer he had expected. "Very reasonable. May I ask one question first?" "Go ahead." "My uncles, as you may know, were the last of our direct line. My father, their younger brother, moved to Chicago in 1954 and largely lost contact with the family. I became aware of 4412 Millbrook Street only last week, when a friend of mine in the Ohio real estate community mentioned the unusually low auction price. I am not here, Mrs. Coleman, to try to take anything from you. I am here because I am curious. Curious about my family, about the building, about what my uncles left behind when they died in Florida in the 1990s. I know this may be difficult to believe, given the circumstances, but I wanted you to hear it directly from me, before any lawyers got involved." Rachel studied his face. She had, over 28 months of widowhood and 12 months of foreclosure fighting, developed a pretty reliable sense of when someone was running a soft con on her. Philip Coleman, if he was running one, was running it at a level of subtlety she had not encountered before. His face was perfectly sincere. His posture was perfectly relaxed. The coat, the shoes, the quiet voice, all said a man who did not particularly need whatever was in the building, and who therefore might be telling the truth about his motives, or who might be extremely good at pretending he did not need it. Rachel decided, in that moment, that she was not going to make the decision about Philip Coleman today. Marsh would handle it. Marsh would dig into him and figure out who he was. "I hear you, Mr. Coleman," she said, "and I hope you understand that I still need to go through my attorney. Mr. Marsh can be reached at the number on his website." "Of course. Have a good afternoon, Mrs. Coleman." "And Emma." He inclined his head toward the back seat. Emma's eyes were wide. Rachel felt a flash of something like alarm, because he knew her daughter's name, which she had not told him, which meant he had done research. Research, in turn, meant he was either a concerned relative or a careful adversary, and Rachel did not yet know which. He walked away. A silver BMW was parked down the block. He got in, and he drove off, and Rachel watched him go in the rearview mirror for a long time. "Who was that, Mom?" Emma asked. "Somebody we need to learn more about," Rachel said. Marsh, when she called him that evening, was quiet for a long moment. "Philip Coleman," he said. "Okay, I'll have Donna run him tomorrow. Do not contact him. Do not respond to any further approach from him until I've had a chance to look at who he is and what he actually wants. And Rachel," he used her first name for the first time, "please be careful. I don't want to alarm you. But cases like this sometimes attract a certain kind of attention, and you are living in a building that everyone in Millbrook now knows is yours, with your daughter. If I were you, I would think about moving, temporarily, to somewhere less visible. I can't afford to move. I can cover a month at an extended stay hotel, out of the expense budget. It won't affect your settlement. I strongly suggest you take me up on this." Rachel thought about it for a long time that night. She looked at the plywood over the windows. She looked at the cheap brass padlock on the back door, which she had replaced with a better one, but which was still, in the end, a padlock on a building that everyone knew contained a woman and a child alone. She thought about the vault in the basement, and about the 3 security cameras Marsh had installed the week before, which would send her phone an alert if anyone came within 10 feet of the back door. She thought about Emma, who had slept peacefully every night in this building, who had started, unbelievably, to like it, who called the second-floor apartment our room, who had decorated the wall above the bed with her own drawings of horses. She thought about moving them to a hotel 2 towns over, and about the months of unknown duration the legal case was going to take, and about whether a hotel was actually any safer than a fortified old building with functional locks and cameras. The next morning she called Marsh back and told him she wanted to stay. But she asked him to arrange for a proper alarm system, a real one, with motion sensors on all floors, and she asked him to help her install a deadbolt on the second-floor apartment door itself, so that even if someone got into the building, they could not get into the room where she and Emma slept. Marsh, who sounded tired on the phone, said okay. He said, "I hear you." He said, "We will make it work." 2 days later, Marsh called back. He had the initial results on Philip Coleman. Philip R. Coleman, 66 years old, lived in a suburb of Chicago, ran a small private investment firm with $35 million under management. He was real. He was, at least on paper, the real nephew of James and Robert Coleman, his father Albert having been their younger brother, the one who had left Millbrook in 1954 to work in commodities trading in Chicago. Philip had never met his uncles in person, according to his own bio. He had learned about them from his father's stories. He had no criminal record. His business was clean. He paid his taxes on time. He donated to the Chicago Symphony and to a food bank on the South Side. "So he's legit," Rachel said. "He is a legitimate relative of the Coleman brothers, yes. That is what the paperwork says. Whether he is legitimate in his intentions toward you is a different question, and it is one we cannot answer until he tells us what he wants, which he will do when we meet with him, which is scheduled for next Tuesday, the 15th, at my office at 2 o'clock. He will bring his attorney. I will bring you, if you are willing to come, and Curtis Delaney, who will sit in as my expert consultant. Are you willing to come?" "Yes." "Good. I will do most of the talking. If he asks you a direct question, answer it briefly and honestly. If he tries to rattle you, let me handle it. Are we clear?" "We're clear." Rachel spent the weekend preparing. She read her own paperwork, the auction confirmation, the deed transfer, the tax lien assumption document, the city's surplus property ordinance. She made Emma come with her to the library on Saturday so she could use the computers there, and she did her own research on Philip Coleman, finding his LinkedIn profile, his company website, and 2 old newspaper articles from Chicago business journals. He looked exactly like what Marsh had said, a legitimate money manager with a modest firm and a polished life. Nothing about him screamed con artist, but nothing screamed saint, either. On Monday evening, Mrs. Dalworth came to the building. Rachel heard the knock on the front door at 7:24 p.m. She looked at the security camera feed on her phone and saw Mrs. Dalworth standing on the sidewalk, wrapped in her green winter coat, holding what looked like a casserole dish. Rachel closed her eyes for a second. Then she opened them. She went downstairs, and she opened the front door, and she stood in the doorway so that Mrs. Dalworth could not see past her into the building. "Mrs. Dalworth." "Rachel, honey." Mrs. Dalworth's voice was drenched in the syrup of a person who had rehearsed what she was going to say. I've been hearing the most extraordinary things. I wanted to come by and see you, to let you know. The neighborhood has been so worried. I've been so worried, and I brought you my chicken casserole, the one you used to like, remember, at the block party 3 years ago. I thought you and Emma might. Thank you, Mrs. Dalworth. That's very kind. I'll take it. Rachel took the casserole. It was warm. It smelled good. Rachel had not tasted Mrs. Dalworth's cooking in 3 years, and she did not particularly want to now. May I come in? I'd love to see what you've done with the place. Everyone is saying, Mrs. Dalworth, Rachel said, in the steadiest voice she had used to anyone in 2.5 years. I appreciate the casserole. I really do. But this is not a good time for a visit. Emma is just getting ready for bed, and I have work to do, and the building is not really set up for guests. I hope you understand. Mrs. Dalworth's face did something interesting. It flickered. For a moment, the mask slipped, and Rachel saw, underneath it, the woman who had told her friend 3 weeks ago that some people just weren't cut out to be homeowners. The woman who, when Rachel and Emma had been dragging garbage bags of clothes to the Accord, had watched from her side of the fence and had not offered to help, had not offered to take Emma for the afternoon, had not offered anything except a pitying look she'd probably thought was kindness. Rachel watched that flicker, and she watched Mrs. Dalworth's face rearrange itself into the sympathetic mask. Of course, you must be so tired. I'll bring the dish back tomorrow. Oh, and Rachel, the neighborhood has been talking. Some of us were wondering, all of us were wondering, if you'd be interested in coming to a little get-together at the Hendersons' house on Saturday. Just neighbors. Just to, catch up. Everyone would love to see you again. Rachel looked at her for a long moment. Mrs. Dalworth, 3 weeks ago you stood by your fence and watched us leave our house with everything we owned in garbage bags, and you did not offer to help. You told your friend Sandra, loudly enough for my daughter to hear, that some people weren't cut out to be homeowners. I know you said it, because Emma heard you say it. And now you're here with a chicken casserole, because you've heard rumors that maybe I have some money after all. I want you to go home now, and I want you to not come back. And I want you to tell your friends in the neighborhood that we will not be attending any get-togethers at the Hendersons' house or anywhere else. We are fine. We are busy. We have a life, Mrs. Dalworth. We always did. You just couldn't see it because you never bothered to look. Rachel stepped back. She closed the door. She locked it. She did not slam it. She did not raise her voice. She stood in the dark hallway of her condemned building, and she held a chicken casserole that she intended to throw directly into the dumpster at the end of the block, and she felt something she had not felt in a very long time, which was the clean, bright anger of a person who had finally said the true thing out loud. Upstairs, Emma was waiting. She had heard the whole thing through the floor. Mom, was that Mrs. Dalworth? Yes, baby. Did you tell her off? I told her the truth, honey. Which is a kind of telling off, I guess. Emma nodded slowly. She considered this. Then she said, Good. Rachel put the casserole on the small wooden table. She looked at her daughter, who had heard her mother defend herself, probably for the first time in Emma's living memory, and who had said good. She sat down on the edge of the bed, and Emma crawled into her lap, and they stayed like that for a while. The meeting with Philip Coleman was the next day. Rachel drove to Sandusky in the morning, dropped Emma at Donna's desk, where the horse-coloring book was waiting for her again, and walked into Theodore Marsh's conference room at 1:57 p.m. Marsh was there. Curtis Delaney was there. At 2 o'clock exactly, Donna opened the door, and Philip Coleman walked in, accompanied by a woman in a charcoal suit who introduced herself as his attorney, Elena Vargas of a Chicago firm Rachel had heard of because it was the kind of firm that advertised on billboards during NFL games. They sat. Marsh made introductions. He offered coffee. Elena Vargas declined. Philip Coleman accepted. Donna brought the coffee. Rachel observed that Philip Coleman took his coffee black, without sugar, and that his hands were steady when he lifted the cup. Marsh began. Mr. Coleman, we understand you have expressed interest in the property at 4412 Millbrook Street, and, specifically, in its contents. My client, Mrs. Coleman, has asked me to represent her in any discussions with you. I'd like to start by asking you, directly, to state your interest and your position. Philip Coleman set down his coffee cup. He folded his hands in front of him. He looked at Rachel. He looked at Marsh. He said, Mr. Marsh, Mrs. Coleman, I will not insult any of you by pretending this is purely a sentimental visit. It is sentimental, in part. I did not know my uncles, and I am curious about what they built. But you are correct to assume I am here for more than family history. So let me be blunt. My attorney has advised me that, as the only surviving blood relative of James and Robert Coleman, I may have standing to contest certain assets from their estates that were not properly distributed at the time of their deaths. Namely, whatever assets were stored in the building at 4412 Millbrook, which by all indications my uncles hid from their estate planning deliberately. She has prepared paperwork for a potential claim. That paperwork is in her briefcase. I have not asked her to file it. He paused. He looked at Rachel. I have not asked her to file it, he said, because the more I have learned about you over the past 2 weeks, Mrs. Coleman, the less certain I am that I want to. I know your husband died. I know you lost your home 3 weeks ago. I know your daughter is 8. I know you are a nurse with a current license who cannot currently find work. I know you purchased the property for $6 because it was the only shelter you could afford. I know that, according to Mr. Marsh, you have not removed a single item from the basement, which tells me something about your character. And I know, because I had the paperwork pulled, that my great-great-grandfather and your late husband's great-grandfather were the same man, which makes your daughter Emma a direct descendant of Samuel Coleman, who was my uncle's grandfather. The room was very quiet. Rachel's mouth had gone dry. Elena Vargas looked at her client with the carefully blank expression of an attorney whose client was, apparently, going off script. So, Philip Coleman continued, here is what I came to say. I will not contest your ownership of 4412 Millbrook Street or its contents. I will sign whatever waiver, release, or settlement your attorney wishes to draw up, in exchange for exactly 2 things. 1, an agreement that I may, at some future point, visit the building and see the ledgers my uncle kept, because I would like to understand what my family was, and those ledgers are the closest thing to a window I will ever get. 2, a small keepsake from the vault, of your choosing, to remember my uncles by. Not a valuable piece, not a coin, not a painting, a photograph, a small object, a token, something that has meaning but not market value. Those are my terms. I do not want a percentage. I do not want a share. I do not want anything except a chance to know my family and a memento. Elena Vargas closed her eyes briefly and then opened them. Marsh said, quietly, Mr. Coleman, that is an extraordinarily generous position. May I ask why? Philip Coleman looked at Rachel for a long moment. Mr. Marsh, I have $35 million under management. I am 66 years old. I have 2 grown children, 4 grandchildren, and a wife I have been married to for 41 years. I do not need the money, and I have spent the last 2 weeks, since I first heard about this building, thinking about what my uncles would have wanted. They were, from everything I know, good men. Difficult men, eccentric men, lonely men. But good. They left that letter in that desk for a reason. They wanted someone who needed the vault to find it. They wanted that person to be the one who inherited it. The law might possibly say otherwise, in a long and expensive court case. But what is legal and what is right are not always the same thing. I am choosing to do what I think is right. If that makes me a fool, then I am a fool. My wife would tell you I am often a fool, but I am at peace with it. Rachel could not speak. Marsh, after a moment, turned to her. Mrs. Coleman? She opened her mouth. She closed it. She opened it again. Mr. Coleman, she finally said. Thank you. I accept your terms. And I want to add a third thing, if you'll allow it. I want to share the ledgers with you. Not just a visit. Actual access, for however long you need. So you can know your family. It's the least I can do. Philip Coleman's face did something. It was not quite a smile. It was the expression of a man who had hoped for something and had been afraid to expect it, and who had just received it anyway. Mrs. Coleman, he said, that would mean a great deal. After the meeting, after the paperwork was drafted and signed and notarized, after Philip Coleman and Elena Vargas had left, Marsh sat at the conference table across from Rachel and let out a breath. Rachel, he said, do you understand what just happened? I think so. The single biggest threat to your claim just walked in here and signed away his rights for a photograph and a meeting. That does not happen. That almost never happens. In 23 years, I have seen that happen exactly once before. It happened because he is, apparently, a good man. And because you, apparently, did not try to hide from him, and he saw who you were. I want you to understand that you did something right 3 weeks ago, when you stopped at the curb instead of driving past him, when you didn't try to fight him from behind your attorney. You treated him like a human being. He noticed. Rachel did not know what to say. She nodded. Now, Marsh said, the hard part starts. The city. Because believe me, Mrs. Coleman, the city is going to come next. The city came, as Marsh had predicted, on the morning of December 22nd. A man named Thomas Burleson, the Millbrook city solicitor, sent a certified letter via overnight express. The letter was polite, professionally worded, and contained, in its fourth paragraph, a sentence that made Rachel's throat close. The city of Millbrook believes that certain assets present within the property at 4412 Millbrook Street at the time of conveyance may have been outside the scope of the municipal surplus auction, as such assets were not disclosed, inspected, or assessed for inclusion in the sale, and may represent unclaimed property subject to Ohio Revised Code provisions governing the reversion of unclaimed personalty to the municipality upon tax forfeiture. Marsh read the letter out loud to Rachel over the phone at 9:12 a.m. What does that mean? She said. It means they want the vault. They're going to argue that the coins, the paintings, and the certificates are unclaimed personal property, separate from the real property conveyance, and that they should revert to the city. They're wrong, legally, but they're going to make us prove it. And if they want to drag this out in court, they can drag it out for years. Rachel closed her eyes. She was sitting on the edge of Emma's bed. Emma was at school. The morning light was coming through the plywood in thin gold slats, and Rachel had been, a moment ago, in the middle of unpacking the small Christmas tree she had bought for Emma at the dollar store, a 12-inch fake plastic tree with wire branches and no decorations. Because it was 3 days until Christmas, and Emma had still not asked for presents, and Rachel had not been able to bear it any longer. What do we do? She said. We fight them, Marsh said. And Rachel, we're going to win. The law is clear. The ordinance is clear. The auction terms are clear. They are going to lose. But we have to go through the fight. And the fight is going to be loud, and it is going to be public, and by the end of January, Rachel, every person in Millbrook is going to know your name, and is going to know what was in that basement. Are you ready for that? Rachel looked around the room, at the plastic tree on the wooden table, at Emma's drawings of horses on the wall, at the mattress with the blankets where her daughter had begun, against all reason, to call this place our room, at the steel door of the second-floor apartment, which she had installed with her own hands, because after everything, she was still Rachel Coleman, who had rebuilt a transmission by sound alone 3 years ago at St. Catherine's when a patient's family had needed a ride home and their car wouldn't start in the lot. Yes, she said. I'm ready. Let's fight them. On the other end of the line, Theodore Marsh, attorney at law, tired and competent, and, she was beginning to realize, one of the best men she had ever met, said quietly, That's my girl. We'll start tomorrow. Rachel hung up the phone. She finished setting up the plastic Christmas tree. She taped 3 of Emma's horse drawings to the wall around it, as a kind of makeshift tinsel. She looked at the brass key sitting on the wooden table, the key James Coleman Jr. had left her, the key that had unlocked a door that had been waiting 36 years, and she thought about the road ahead, and about how far she still had to go, and about the city of Millbrook, and about Mrs. Dalworth, and about the newspaper articles that would come soon, and about the hearings and the depositions and the lawyers and the questions. And for the first time since she had walked across the street with her cheap brass padlock and her daughter in tow, Rachel Coleman, 34 years old and widowed and broke, and no longer quite broken, felt something that was not fear. She felt ready. The legal battle with the city of Millbrook took 71 days from first filing to final ruling. 71 days that blurred into a single long corridor of courtrooms, depositions, sleepless nights, and fluorescent-lit hallways where Rachel sat on hard wooden benches with Emma's school folder on her lap, answering questions from reporters who had not known her name 3 months ago and who now pronounced it as if they had always known it. Rachel Coleman, the widow who bought a building for $6. The Millbrook miracle. The case that had every probate lawyer in Ohio on the edge of their seat. Because if the city won, every surplus auction in the state from the last 15 years could be reopened, and if Rachel won, the principle that as is meant as is would be reaffirmed with the force of case law. Thomas Burleson, the city solicitor, was a small, tidy man in his early 50s with rimless glasses and the manner of someone who had worked in municipal law long enough to believe that paperwork was a form of moral virtue. His argument, when he laid it out at the first hearing on January 8th, was carefully constructed. The city, he argued, had not known of the vault's existence at the time of the auction. The city, therefore, had not valued those assets in the sale price. The city, therefore, had in effect conveyed the property under a fundamental mistake of fact, which under Ohio contract law was grounds for rescission of the unknown asset portion of the sale. He did not want to unwind the real estate transaction. He was, he said, quite willing to let Mrs. Coleman keep the building itself, which the city would have been glad to be rid of for $6 in any case. He simply wanted the personal property inside the vault to be returned to the city, which would then handle it through proper unclaimed property procedures. Marsh let him finish. Then he stood up. He was wearing his good suit, which Rachel had only ever seen him wear on the day of the Philip Coleman meeting. He had a legal pad in one hand and a single sheet of paper in the other. "Your Honor," he said, "the city's argument rests on the premise that the vault contents were personal property separable from the real estate conveyance. They were not. They were fixtures of the building, permanently installed in a sealed concrete chamber built into the foundation, behind a steel door with a combination lock, in a structure that predated the current municipal ownership by nearly a century. The city did not own these items. The city never owned these items. They were the personal assets of James Coleman Sr., placed in a private vault in a privately owned building, which passed to his heirs, and which were subsequently included, as a matter of settled law under the Uniform Commercial Code and Ohio Revised Code Section 5323.02, in the real property conveyance that transferred the building to Mrs. Coleman on November 19th of last year. The city's claim is not merely legally wrong. It is structurally incoherent." He handed the single sheet of paper to the bailiff, who handed it to the judge. "This," Marsh said, "is a copy of the Millbrook Municipal Surplus Auction Ordinance, Section 4.3. It states, and I quote, 'All personal property present within the boundaries of the real estate at the time of auction closing shall be deemed to have been conveyed with the real estate, and no claim shall be made by the municipality for reversion of such personal property subsequent to the transfer of deed.'" End quote. The city wrote this ordinance. The city adopted this ordinance. The city has operated under this ordinance since 2004. Mrs. Coleman did not know about this ordinance when she bought the building. I did not know about this ordinance when I took her case. But it exists. It is the law, and it is dispositive. Thomas Burleson's face, at the plaintiff's table, did something Rachel would remember for years. It went, briefly, the color of old paper. He had, apparently, not known about Section 4.3 either. Or he had known and had hoped that Marsh would not find it. The judge, a woman named Patricia Hensley who had been on the Erie County bench for 19 years, read the paragraph twice. She looked up. She looked at Burleson. She said, "Mr. Burleson, is the city aware of its own ordinance?" Burleson stood up. He said, "Your Honor, we believe that the ordinance may be subject to interpretation in light of the unusual, Mr. Burleson. The ordinance is not subject to interpretation. The ordinance is written in plain English. I can read it. You can read it. Everyone in this courtroom can read it. The city wrote a rule, and the city has to follow it. Is there anything else you wish to argue, or shall I rule from the bench?" The ruling, when it came 40 minutes later after Judge Hensley had taken a recess to review Marsh's supporting case law, was 31 pages long, but the operative sentence was on page 4. In favor of the defendant, Mrs. Rachel Coleman. All contents of the vault at 4412 Millbrook Street were the sole and legal property of the defendant, conveyed with the real estate in accordance with municipal ordinance and state law. The city's claim was dismissed with prejudice. Court costs were assessed against the city. When Judge Hensley's gavel came down, Rachel did not move for a long moment. She had been preparing herself, for 71 days, for some version of this not quite working, for the judge to find some small opening for the city, for the ruling to be partial, for there to be an appeal, for the fight to continue. The gavel came down again. Marsh turned to her. "Rachel, we won. All of it. Clean." She stood up because he was standing up. Her legs did not feel attached to her body. She walked out of the courtroom in a kind of tunnel. Reporters were waiting in the hallway. Marsh stepped in front of her and said, "Mrs. Coleman will make a statement on the courthouse steps in 15 minutes. Please wait there." He steered her past them, into a side room, and he closed the door, and he poured her a glass of water from a pitcher on the table, and he watched her drink it. "Okay," he said. "Take a minute. Take 10 minutes if you need them." She took 3. Then she walked out onto the courthouse steps, with Marsh beside her, and she faced the cameras, and she read the statement he had helped her prepare that morning. "My daughter and I are grateful to the court for its fair and thorough consideration of this case. We are grateful to our attorney, Mr. Theodore Marsh, whose belief in us made this possible when we had nothing else. We are grateful to Philip Coleman, a kind man we did not know 6 months ago, who showed us what family could mean. And we are grateful to the memory of James and Robert Coleman, whose gift we intend to honor by using what they left behind in the way they asked us to use it. We have no further comment today. Thank you." Somewhere in the crowd, she saw Mrs. Dalworth. The woman had driven 40 minutes to Sandusky to stand at the back of a press conference. Rachel looked at her for exactly 1 second. Mrs. Dalworth's face flushed. Rachel looked away without changing her expression and walked down the steps to where Emma was waiting with Donna, who had driven her up from school in Donna's own car. And she picked up her daughter, and she held her, and Emma whispered into her ear, "Did we win, Mom?" "Yeah, baby. We won." The liquidation began in March, carefully and quietly, under Marsh's supervision and with the assistance of Curtis Delaney and a team of specialists he brought in from Sotheby's and from a numismatic firm in New York. Over the course of the spring, the coin collection went first, sold through a combination of private sale and structured auction across 4 months, so as not to flood the market and depress prices. The final numismatic total came in at $49 million, higher than Curtis's midpoint estimate. Rachel paid the taxes as they came due, quarter by quarter, through a firm Marsh had recommended, and she did not, at any point, try to hide or defer a single dollar of tax liability, because she had watched Ashford's letter in Jennifer Torres's story, which she had never read, but which her own conscience had somehow written for her anyway, and she had decided long ago that she was going to do this right or not at all. The paintings were next. The George Innes was authenticated and sold to a private collector in Connecticut for $4.2 million. The Chase sold at Christie's spring sale for just over $900,000. The European piece, which Curtis had tentatively identified as possibly Dutch, turned out to be a small studio work by a contemporary of Rembrandt, not the master himself but a known pupil, and it sold for a respectable $1.8 million. The 10 other American paintings averaged $92,000 apiece. Total painting proceeds, $9.7 million. The stock certificates were the slowest and most complicated. Marsh brought in a specialist firm in Cleveland that did nothing but trace historical equity holdings. Of the 400 certificates, 243 were successfully traced to existing corporate holdings with associated reinvested dividends. The net present value of those holdings, after taxes and fees and the specialist firm's percentage, came in at $78 million. The wooden safe in the middle of the vault was opened in May by a locksmith Marsh had flown in from Philadelphia, a man in his 70s who had opened safes for estate settlements for 50 years. Inside was a smaller collection of personal items. A gold watch engraved with James Coleman Sr.'s initials. 2 small velvet pouches of uncut diamonds that appraised at roughly $300,000. A stack of letters tied with a faded ribbon, written between James Sr. and his late wife during the Second World War, letters that Rachel did not read because they did not belong to her, and that she sent, with Philip Coleman's permission, to the Millbrook Historical Society. And at the bottom of the safe, wrapped in oilcloth, one final object. A silver pocket watch with a chain. Engraved on the inside of the case, in small letters, "For my son Samuel, with all my love, Father, 1887. Samuel Coleman." The great-great-grandfather. The one Philip and David, and therefore Emma, all descended from. Rachel gave the pocket watch to Philip Coleman in person, at her kitchen table, in the new house she bought in late April. It was a modest 4-bedroom on the west side of town, nothing grand, with a finished basement and a backyard big enough for a swing set and a dogwood tree. Philip had driven down from Chicago. He sat at her table, and he held the watch in his hand, and he did not speak for a long time, and when he did, his voice was rough. "Mrs. Coleman. Rachel. Thank you. I don't know how to say how much this means. This was my grandfather's grandfather. I grew up hearing about him. I never thought I would hold anything of his in my hands. Philip, you said at our first meeting that you wanted a keepsake. This is the one that should be yours. It's the one that connects your line to the one that ended with James and Robert. It belongs with you. I would like, someday, for my daughter to know your grandchildren. I would like for us to be family. Philip Coleman, 66 years old, Chicago investment manager, father of 2 and grandfather of 4, sat at Rachel Coleman's kitchen table and quietly wept. Then he collected himself, and he wiped his eyes, and he said, "Rachel, it would be a great honor." The final accounting, after legal fees, taxes, and Marsh's 10% contingency, settled Rachel Coleman's net position at just over $73 million. She did not tell Emma the number. She did not tell anyone the number except Marsh and her accountant. The number was not the point. The point was what came next. In June, Rachel hired a contractor to begin the restoration of 4412 Millbrook Street. Not demolition, restoration. She had talked it over with Emma for weeks. The building had saved their lives. Rachel was not going to tear it down. She was going to bring it back. The restoration took 11 months. The rotted sections of roof were rebuilt. The windows were replaced with storm-rated modern glass in the original frames. The tin ceiling on the first floor was cleaned and repainted its original cream color. The hardwood floors were refinished. The staircases were stabilized. The plumbing and electrical systems were replaced entirely to current code. The basement was dried and sealed. The old storefront on the first floor was converted into what Rachel called the reading room, a free community space with shelves of donated books, a children's corner with bean bags and picture books, and 4 tables where anyone could sit and work, study, or read, with free Wi-Fi and free coffee, no purchase required, no time limit, no questions asked. The second floor became 3 transitional housing units, fully furnished, intended for single parents who were between situations and who needed a month or 3 to get back on their feet. The third floor, the space that had held James Coleman Sr.'s rolltop desk, became the offices of the newly formed Coleman Brothers Foundation, which Rachel endowed with $20 million out of her settlement. The foundation had one purpose: to help families in Millbrook and the surrounding counties who were at risk of losing their homes to foreclosure. No shame, no lectures, no forms asking them to justify their circumstances. Just direct assistance. Mortgage arrears caught up. Tax liens paid. Utility bills covered. Medical debts negotiated. And, for the families who had already lost everything and were starting over, the kind of first-step support that Rachel had not had when she had been standing in her own living room watching the locksmith change her locks. Security deposits. First month's rent. Work. Clothes. A working car. Whatever it took to keep a family together and keep a child in their school district and keep a parent from being broken by the particular species of American poverty that could swallow a widow and a child in 90 days. Theodore Marsh joined the foundation's board, pro bono. Philip Coleman joined as vice chair, in memory of his uncles. Curtis Delaney became the foundation's art director because they had acquired, in June, a small but good collection of local Ohio artists to hang in the reading room and in the transitional apartments, on the theory that people in difficult circumstances deserved beauty as much as people who were doing fine. The first family the foundation helped was a single mother named Deshandra Williams and her 2 sons, ages 6 and 9, who had been evicted from their apartment in Fremont 3 weeks earlier and were staying with Deshandra's cousin in a 1-bedroom unit that was already housing 4 adults. Rachel personally delivered the envelope to Deshandra at the cousin's apartment on a Thursday afternoon in August. Security deposit. First and last month's rent on a 2-bedroom in Millbrook, 3 blocks from the elementary school. A gift card to a furniture consignment shop where Deshandra could pick out whatever she and her boys needed, no dollar cap. A letter confirming that a licensed nursing assistant training program at the community college had been prepaid, with childcare during class hours covered. Deshandra Williams opened the envelope. She read the letter. She read it a second time. She put her hand over her mouth. "This is not," she said, "a scam. No, ma'am. It is not a scam. My name is Rachel Coleman. 3 years ago, I lost my husband. 8 months ago, I lost my house. Last November, my daughter and I slept in a condemned building in Millbrook because it was all we could afford. Since then, some things have changed for me. And I made a promise that if they changed, I would not just be the person who had gotten lucky. I would try to be the person who turned the luck into something that meant something. Your file came across my desk this week. This is what I do now. Please take it. Deshandra Williams did not speak for a long time. Then she said, "Why are you really doing this?" "Because I've been poor a long time, and I know people don't do things for other people for no reason. I have a reason. My reason is my daughter Emma. She is 8 years old. 2 years ago, she learned that some people slept in cars and some people did not, and she learned what side of that line she was on for a while, and I do not want any child in this county to have to learn that if I can help it. That is my reason." Deshandra Williams looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, "My older boy, Marcus, he's 9. He's been having a hard time. If my boys are going to live in Millbrook, is there any way, I don't even know if this is possible, is there any way you could meet them? Just so they could see that good things can come from strangers? Because I don't think he believes that right now." Rachel smiled. "I would love to meet your boys." She met them that Saturday. Marcus, 9 years old, skinny and watchful, shook her hand solemnly at the door of the 2-bedroom apartment his mother had just signed the lease on, and he looked at Rachel with the careful appraising eyes of a child who had already learned to expect disappointment. Rachel introduced him to Emma. Emma, who was just turning 9 herself, held out her hand and said, "Hi, I'm Emma. My mom and I slept in a building for 3 weeks when our house got taken. It was scary for a little bit, and then it was okay. If you want, I can tell you about it." Marcus looked at Emma. He looked at his mother. He looked back at Emma. He said, "Okay." They sat on the floor of the empty apartment, and Emma, 8 years old and already, apparently, possessed of more grace than most adults Rachel had ever met, told Marcus about the condemned building, about the plywood over the windows, about the candles, about the rolltop desk on the 3rd floor, about how her mother had found a letter from a dead man and how the dead man had left them a present, because sometimes people left things for people they did not know, and sometimes those presents were very small like a photograph, and sometimes they were very big like a building, and either way the thing that mattered was that somebody had been thinking about somebody else, and that meant nobody was really alone even when it felt like it. Marcus listened. Rachel watched her daughter, who had been born to David 17 days before the start of winter and who had lost her father at 6 and her home at 8 and who was now, at 9, sitting cross-legged on a linoleum floor in an apartment that did not yet have furniture, explaining to a boy she had just met why the world was still okay. Rachel had to look away for a moment. She had to compose herself. She did compose herself. She looked back. "Mom," Emma said, "can Marcus come to my birthday party?" "Yes, baby. Of course." Mrs. Dalworth wrote a letter in October. It arrived in the foundation's P.O. box because Rachel had not given her home address to anyone in the old neighborhood. The letter was 3 pages long, handwritten on rose-colored stationery. It was the kind of letter Rachel recognized. The kind of letter that begins with "I hope this finds you well" and proceeds, after extensive preamble, to its actual purpose, which was to ask whether Rachel might be interested in joining a charitable committee Mrs. Dalworth was forming to raise funds for the beautification of the Millbrook Neighborhood Association. The letter included, on page 2, a mention of how much Mrs. Dalworth had always admired Rachel's strength during her difficult time, and how grateful she was that things had worked out for Emma, who was such a sweet girl. Rachel read the letter once, in the foundation office on the 3rd floor of the restored building. She sat with it on her desk for about 10 minutes. Then she picked up a pen, and she wrote a short reply on foundation letterhead. "Dear Mrs. Dalworth, thank you for your letter. I will not be joining your committee. My time and the foundation's resources are committed to the families of Millbrook and surrounding counties who are at risk of losing their homes, a group with which you are unlikely to share common cause. I wish you well. Sincerely, Rachel Coleman." She sent the letter, and she did not think about Mrs. Dalworth again. Not with anger. Not with satisfaction. Just not. Mrs. Dalworth had become, at some point in the previous year, a person Rachel no longer had room for. In November, on the 1-year anniversary of the night she had first stood on the sidewalk of Millbrook Street with a cheap brass padlock in her hand, Rachel took Emma back to the building. The restoration was complete. The reading room was open. 3 families were living in the transitional apartments upstairs. The foundation had helped, in its first 6 months of operation, 47 families and prevented 19 foreclosures in a town of 9,000 people, which had started to change the conversations that were being held in that town about what kind of place Millbrook was. Rachel and Emma walked through the front door together. The hinges did not scream anymore. They had been oiled. The tin ceiling shone cream and gold overhead. A teenage boy was sitting at one of the reading tables, doing homework, drinking the free coffee. He looked up. He said, "Hi, Mrs. Coleman." "Hi, Jamal. How's AP chemistry going?" "Kicking my butt." "I know it is. Hang in there." Rachel and Emma climbed the stairs. Not the narrow back stairs. The main staircase, which had been rebuilt with new treads and the original banister refinished. They walked past the transitional apartments on the second floor, where the hallway was painted a warm yellow and hung with one of Curtis Delaney's acquired Ohio landscapes. They climbed to the third floor, to the foundation offices. Rachel unlocked the room that was now her personal office. It was the same space where the rolltop desk had stood. She had kept the desk. It had been restored, the dust cleaned off, the drawers oiled, the rolltop sliding smoothly now. It sat against the same wall it had sat against when James Coleman Sr. had used it 100 years ago. On the wall above it, in a simple wooden frame, hung the photograph. Dad, Mom, Jimmy and Bobby. 1988, our last summer here. Emma walked to the desk. She ran her hand along the polished wood. She looked up at the photograph. "Mom, do you think they know?" "Who, baby?" "The people in the picture. Do you think they know what you did with their present?" Rachel looked at the photograph. At James Coleman Sr., who had died in 1971. At his wife. At Jimmy, who had grown up to be James Jr. and who had died in Florida in 1993. At Bobby, who had grown up to be Robert and who had died in Florida in 1991. She thought about the letter. "I do not know who you are. I do not know what brought you to this place. We do not know if you will be honorable or dishonorable. We leave it in the hands of fate. Honey, I don't know if they know. I don't know how any of that works. But I think, if they can know, they would be happy." Emma nodded. She took her mother's hand. They stood like that for a long time, looking at the photograph. Outside the window, Millbrook Street in late November looked exactly the way it had looked a year before. The same sidewalks, the same leafless trees, the same narrow asphalt road, the same house across the way, 4411 Millbrook, which Rachel had bought back from the bank 3 months ago at fair market value, and which was now occupied by a family she had found through the foundation, a mother named Teresa and 3 children whose own house had been destroyed by a kitchen fire and whose insurance had been fighting them for 10 months. The foundation paid their rent. Rachel did not charge them. She had not set foot inside the old house since the day the bank had taken it. She did not need to. It was a house. Teresa and her kids lived in it now. That was better than Rachel living in it would have been. David, Rachel suspected, would have agreed. Emma tugged on her hand. "Mom, can we go home? I'm hungry." "Yes, baby. Let's go home." They drove home in the car Rachel had bought in April, a practical and unglamorous Toyota Highlander, the same model Jennifer Torres, in another story Rachel had never read, had also chosen for similar reasons. They pulled into the driveway of the modest 4-bedroom on the west side of town. Emma got out. Emma ran ahead, up the front walk, to feed the dog, a medium-sized mixed-breed rescue named Barnaby who had been found wandering a highway rest stop in May and whom Emma had chosen at the shelter on her 9th birthday. Rachel followed more slowly, her hand trailing along the dogwood tree she had planted in the front yard in the spring. She stood at the front door for a moment before going in. She looked up at the sky, which was the particular pale gray of an Ohio November afternoon. She thought about David. She had thought about him every day for 2 years and 10 months, and she would think about him every day for the rest of her life. But lately, when she thought about him, the thinking did not hurt the way it used to. It hurt less, and it warmed more, and she had begun to be able to remember him whole instead of only remembering the ending. "David," she said quietly, to the sky, to the yard, to the dogwood tree. "I hope you know. I hope you can see. She's going to be okay. We're going to be okay." The sky did not answer. It did not have to. Rachel had stopped needing the sky to answer a long time ago. She went inside, to her daughter and her dog in her life, and she closed the door behind her. The snow began to fall over Millbrook that evening, the first real snow of the year. It covered the street and the rooftops and the branches of the dogwood in Rachel's front yard. It covered, 3 blocks away, the restored facade of 4412 Millbrook Street, where the cream-colored letters above the door now read, "Fresh and freshly painted, Coleman Brothers Reading Room and Community Foundation, EST 1923, restored 2024. It covered the houses of every family the foundation had helped in its first 6 months and of every family the foundation would help in the years to come. It covered, not visibly, the place in the cemetery where David Coleman, beloved husband and father, had been buried on a rainy morning in July of 2022 while his widow had held his 7-year-old daughter's hand and had not yet known that 28 months later, her life would begin again. And it covered, up the street, the house of Mrs. Dalworth, who had recently, quietly, stopped being invited to the book club and the bridge club and the Hendersons' holiday party, because word had gotten around about the chicken casserole she had brought to a condemned building, and because Millbrook was a small town, and because people, in the end, noticed who showed up when it was hard and who showed up when it was easy, and they drew their conclusions accordingly. Inside the warm kitchen of the modest house on the west side of town, Rachel Coleman made grilled cheese sandwiches for her daughter. Emma sat at the table doing homework with Barnaby's head in her lap. The brass key from the rolltop desk hung on a nail beside the kitchen window, where Rachel could see it every day, and where she could remember, every day, that the only reason she was standing in this kitchen was because a man named James Coleman Sr. had distrusted banks, and a man named James Coleman Jr. had written a letter, and a woman named Rachel Coleman had spent her last $6 on a condemned building because she had run out of other options. Emma looked up from her math. "Mom, can we have ice cream for dessert?" "Yes, baby. Even though it's a Tuesday?" "Even though it's a Tuesday." Emma went back to her math. The kitchen was warm. The snow kept falling. Somewhere across town, in the office of the Coleman Brothers Foundation, a phone was ringing, and an intake coordinator named Rosa was answering it. And a family that had been hoping for a miracle was about to find out that miracles, sometimes, were just other people who had been where you were and who had decided to come back for you. Rachel slid a plate across the table to her daughter. She sat down. She picked up her own sandwich. She took a bite. Emma, without looking up from her math problem, said, "Mom, yeah, baby, I'm glad you bought the building." Rachel swallowed. She put the sandwich down. "Me too, honey. Even the scary part. Even the scary part. And I'm glad we had to be in it. Because I don't think we would have found the letter if we hadn't been in it. Would we?" Rachel thought about that. About the specific sequence of events that had led her, at 9:47 p.m. on a Tuesday night in November, to the third floor of a condemned building with a candle and a dying phone, and the particular desperate curiosity of a woman who had run out of options and had nothing left to do but explore. About how, if she had found a shelter that night, or if Aunt Linda had answered her phone, or if the weather had been 30 degrees instead of 28, she might never have climbed those stairs. She might never have opened that desk. "No, baby," she said. "I don't think we would have. So it was good we were scared for a little bit. Maybe. It was necessary. That's different from good. But maybe yes." Emma went back to her homework. Barnaby shifted against her leg and let out one of the deep-sized dogs let out when they are warm and content and asleep. The kitchen smelled like grilled cheese and hot coffee and the faint cedar of the firewood in the stove in the next room. Outside, the snow kept falling, and the lights of Millbrook Street flickered on one by one against the gathering dark, and a woman who had once stood on a cracked sidewalk with a cheap brass padlock in her hand and an 8-year-old daughter in a second-hand winter coat did not cry, because she did not need to, because the story was not over, because the story, in fact, was only just beginning. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.